Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Murasaki in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 41, The Broken Memory. Hands joined in front as if in a prayer, her Byakugan was alive. Wind blew sheets of water from the lake that burst into showers of countless droplets on the desolate shore. It was strong as it swept against her, unrelenting. She held her eyes steady. The path was lost. Everything was churned to mud by her feet. Thunder cracking and the rumble of rocks dropping few feet behind her gave her a start. She jumped a little in spite of having seen them fall down one by one behind her back. She was still a scaredy cat, but she had petted and patted that frightened and shivering thing a bit and pulled out a semblance of courage from her spirit. She breathed in deep and loud, air cold like rain in her lungs, face wet and rosy. Suddenly, rain mellowed and wind relented, defeated before the weakest sun. Waves still leapt up, crashed onto the stones, created slapping sounds against pebbles and rocks. Quickly, she moved behind the cover of a thick tree when she saw men appear from beyond the thicket of trees. They were moving fast towards them, bandits. Niji stood a few feet from her, face tense, veins bulging around his eyes. His hair was stuck to the side of his face. Behind her stood Suijitsu. He was wearing a thick water-repellent cloak. The cowl was pulled over his forehead, his eyes fixed on the path in front, and his fingers curled tightly around the sword's hilt in his hand. Something flew to her head, and she ducked in time. It was a blade attached to a long chain. It speared through the tree, sticking out from the other end. Her team had planned to ambush them, but one of them was probably a censor. She twisted her neck and looked up, her hands slipping in the mud, but there was no time. Hinata stood up as fast as she could, her palm out, and her shaking arm stretched. She saw them all, 5 men armed to the teeth. They jumped and stood on the branches high up in the trees and looked down. She raised her head, her eyes catching the droplets and misting over. One of them flashed down, and damn, he was bloody fast. Sword clashed with sword and Suijitsu's cloak floated behind him. He had a grin on his face. He swung his sword wide and sent the man flying back, who slipped and skidded on the ground like a ragdoll and rolled slowly to stand up, but Suijitsu pinned him to the ground. He got slammed back down, blood, fresh and hot, shot up and soaked Suijitsu's face and clothing. The man's face warped with an intense pain of death, and then the expression slightly faded, his eyes dimmed, and just like that, he was dead. Suijitsu licked his lips. His face was washed clean by the rain. He spat out pink when the diluted blood went into his mouth. His grin was widening, showing more and more of his pointy teeth. Suijitsu leapt up and began clashing with another bandit. His sword glanced against the bandit's forehead and drew blood. His head whipped and twisted round, he stumbled back in pain but rushed at Suijitsu again. His teeth clenched together, face a knot of rage. The blade gleamed in the autumn-beaten sunlight. The man swished his blade in the air as though he was swatting flies. Suijitsu was chuckling. Niji was handling 2 bandits with ease. The first one foolishly rushed at him and Niji closed off his 64 chakra points in 2 heartbeats. He was fast. He struck his heart with air palm, and the man got blasted off his feet. He crashed into the tree some 40 feet away, blood dribbling from his mouth. A moment later, he went completely still. Hinata was still not used to this strange life. 5 years inside the claustrophobic walls of her home had made her afraid to tread too far, to venture from the place where she felt safe, a house where she, a prisoner, felt a sense of familiarity with the pots, smell of earth as it would float in through the window at night, soothing sound and slow rush of water running down the slopes. She, somehow, had accepted that life. Now, standing amidst the wilderness, shivering with something of a feeling of fear, Hinata's eyes locked with the man's in a steady gaze. His eyes were hard as smooth, water-washed pebbles, she could not escape their intensity. She moved her arms and settled into a defensive stance, and the man charged. She swiveled around him and tried to hit the chakra points in his arm. She missed. He was faster than she had imagined. He spun away to the right and whipped around with a wide, sweeping strike of his blade. She jerked her head back and hopped back and curled her fingers into fists to create lion fists. Too soon to turn to them, but she had no choice. Chakra fizzled around her hands and took on the fuzzy shape of lions' heads. They looked better than last time, two gauzy and misshapen hand puppets. Hinata put her right fist out when she saw him coming to her. She was ready this time. She did not give him time to make a strike and did a stabbing movement, hitting his right arm. She blocked the chakra points close to his elbow and sucked in bits of his chakra. His arm went limp. A shocked expression crossed his face that quickly turned into a look of rage and shame. He went at her again, relentless to cut off her head. With the swing of his other arm, he moved the sword to sever her hand. She staggered to the side, almost slipping in the mud. A near miss. Her heart made a leap straight to her throat. It was no use. There was no time to calm her heart and feel its uncertain heartbeats become certain. Wind's blast struck at them like a great hand, trying to knock them sideways, but they held their ground. Sounds of grunts and swords clashing did not matter to Hinata. They were overpowered by the blood roaring in her head. To stare in the face of death was a surreal feeling that made her tingle with a fear most exquisite, and her little heart jumped and jumped repeatedly at its continual calls. Taking in a breath so deep, she steadied herself and slipped aside to evade his forward slash that missed her by a hair's breadth and cut a long gash into the tree. She spun around fully and quickly landed several hits on his other arm. It, too, went limp, and the sword dropped from his loose grip, his hands trembling, his face working with a kind of panic as he stared back at her dumbfounded. She shot her arm forward and hit him with air palm that sent him sprawling to the ground. He tried to get up but could not. Hinata breathed out a sigh, and someone pushed her from behind, and she staggered forward and fell down, her face landed into the mud. She heard a laugh from behind her. She strained her neck and supported herself on her elbows. It was Niji. He stood in the straight beams of light, smiling. Two dead men lay by his feet. "You still have a lot to learn," he said and held out his hand. "Your Byakugan's able to see everything around you, but you don't acknowledge it. You did good." Hinata wiped at her face and took his hand. She got to her shaky feet, a sheepish grin on her face. Suijitsu jumped down and tilted his head a little to look at the last bandit who was still amongst the living. "What about I'm? Should I kill I'm or does the cold boss want I'm a worthless thief?" he asked and moved his tongue across his shiny teeth. "Itaki-sama said to bring them all in for interrogation, but they attacked us." "It can't be helped," he said and looked down to his feet at the contorted faces of two bandits. "Only this one survived. It's better than nothing." "Better than nothing, eh? I ain't taking the blame for this." "Yeah, better be ready for some scolding, mate," he said and pushed the large sword into the sheath. "I'm so afraid that me flaccid cock might drop off. Boss is a lil mad bloody hell, he's a fucking nutter. Best be prepared cause lil ol Suijitsu'll say that ya told me ta fuck em all in the arse." He wagged his finger at Niji as if he was reproaching him for being a disobedient little boy. "You can, Suijitsu," Niji said and gave a slow shake of his head. "Take him to the Umbu headquarters. The interrogation team will handle the rest." Suijitsu gave a loud whistle and approached the man. He grabbed him by the arm and roughly pulled him up to his feet. "Don't resist, mate, or I'll cut your head off and say that Niji told us to do it," he said and dragged him forward. "Come Alan. Don't be shy. Don't keep the boss waitin' and his horse twats wettin'. He may look like a fucking, purty lookin', cock blocker, but he's a nasty fella." Suijitsu disappeared behind the rippling mist. The wind was gone, forest, suddenly silent, and the glow of rocks around them returned, a bizarre gray that made everything look bleak and dreary. Hinata took in a single breath and brought her eyes upon Niji. He was sitting down and examining the corpses. Have I passed?" she asked, hesitant. Niji looked up at her. The freckles, of desert sand color, looked so apparent on his fair face now. "I think you have, Hinata-sama," he said, a gentle smile on his lips. At his reassurance, a smile fought with the edge of her anxious lips, nearly winning. "Will I be promoted?" she asked and put her hands to her breast. "That's up to Sasuke-sama," he said and dropped his eyes to the bandit's headband, and the peculiar symbol on it, one which he had never seen. "He can promote you if he thinks that your progress is satisfactory." Hinata felt a pleasant gust of wind upon her face, like something cool was sliding down over something warm. She had not seen Sasuke for weeks. Had he forgotten her? She bit her lower lip and turned her face away. She did everything he had asked of her and still he was distant. Why? She wanted a place in his heart, a tiny place. Was it too much to ask? She had given him all her heart, every little piece. She wanted his love, wanted to feel loved. Almost thoughtlessly, she lowered her eyes. She desired him so much the way she had never desired anything before. It was almost childlike. Yes, around him, she was a girl child, and he, her favorite folk-tale prince. She wanted to play with him whenever her heart wanted. It was selfish, it was no lie. When the ache consumed her, she wanted him to satisfy her passions, yet he played hide-and-seek with her, always. He was not being fair. Where is he? She asked in an uncertain voice, head down, eyes hidden behind her hair. He got injured during a mission and broke his arm and ribs. He's recuperating. He should be back in a week, he said and raised his head to meet her wide eyes. Is he alright? She asked suddenly, looking up, voice a little loud. Niji smiled. He's all right. I visited him last night. His arm is still a bit broken. He won't be able to leave the manor because of the head ceremony, but he's all right, he said and looked curiously at her. That smile was still on his lips. All right, she mumbled and looked down to her fingers, clasped together nervously. Is Ataka-sama taking over the head seat? Yes, he said and wiped his face on his sleeve. It's not a surprise. He was the most suitable candidate for the seat. Some clansmen wanted Suzuki-sama to lead, but he's too young and Ataka-sama wouldn't have allowed it. His voice faded in the patters of drizzle, and then he went about his business of examining the corpses again. Can he force him like that? She asked, her face tightening in something of a scowl. She truly hated Ataka. He let out a short laugh. He's the eldest son of the Uchiha clan's head. Fugaku-sama passed away, but all his power and authority went over to him. His vote matters a lot in all clan affairs. It carries weight. He can forbid Suzuki-sama from becoming a head and he won't be able to do a thing about it. He can put all kinds of restrictions on him. His position gives him the right, but Suzuki-sama can't do that in return. It's just the way it is amongst the Uchihas. With this new position, his political power has greatly increased in and out of the clan. Our clan works a little differently, Hinata-sama, he said and his smile lessened without disappearing. Please, don't use that honorific. You're no longer the head of a branch family. It doesn't exist anymore. I don't like it. Call me by my name, she said, and her face suddenly flushed. She averted his eyes and felt his shocked gaze burning over her face. He did not say anything for several seconds, and that silence made her nervous. Thank you, Hinata, he whispered and got to his feet. We only needed one vote from the head family, and you came through. I'm grateful. Hinata heard the wind whistling, and mist dispersed for a moment as if lifting the curtain of distance between them. She saw his face clearly now. The memories had long since faded, but it did not seem right to bury and forget them. Her heart pulsated, and she felt longing and sadness wash through her. It would have been better had her father wedded her off to him, but it was all in the past. It was no use thinking that way now. The thought brought a sigh to her lips, and she surrendered to this fate, the only thing she could do. That was the only thing I could give. I'm sorry that I couldn't be of any more help. She paused, breathing in to find her wind of courage. I'm sorry. If Suzuki-sama hadn't asked me, I wouldn't even have known about it. I've been so selfish. I hope you forgive me. Her eyes suddenly glistened with tears, and she looked down. Hinata, it's not your fault. I have. But it is, she cut him off, cheeks red with emotions. It is, Niji. I could have talked to Oto-sama, but I was always chasing after Naruto-kun, always worried about myself. I never asked you how you felt. It was selfish. I admit it. I should have done it a lot sooner. You didn't deserve this. I hope you find it in your heart to forgive me. And she spoke no more and turned her face towards the mist that hid her away. He looked surprised, silent, and did not know what to say. They stood in the rising mist, and she felt something move in her, and she did not know why. The same dim room, and the same people. He could see every wrinkle, every twisted hair, every shadow on their decrepit faces. Itaka sympathizers were having fun tonight. The drooping eyes of one such man, who fixed upon Suzuki his eyes when he glared up at him to return his Sharingan's aggression with a mightier one of his own, which was enough to put his to sleep, found their peace, but it was not as though it even mattered, not as though he was here of his own free will, so he sat in forced silence and looked at the light of the only lantern in the room, soothing men, and molding dark. It was like these men loved the dark, but loved the crow more. It was a cover for them, a deception. 2 large pots were placed in front of Suzuki and Itaka. His older brother was quiet, dressed in a traditional kimono and hakama and a black haori. The cloth was embroidered with colored threads to create the fan symbols close to each sleeve. He was forced to wear one. It was an important day, after all. He wanted to scoff. He had no desire to come to this ceremony, yet he was made to. Finally, another man cast the vote into the pot and exited the room through a sliding door on the right. A steady stream of clansmen came in and went out. It was a silly way to cast votes, 1 pot for yes and 1 pot for no. Yes, it was that simple. Time went by and darkness came running into the room that was no less welcoming, now that it bore more of night. It was almost pitch black behind the partition screen, its bright colors, but a faded tail in the shadows. He could see nary a thing around the altar behind the elders' backs, not without Sharingan's solace. His grandmother, Rao, sat opposite Itaka. Her small eyes were bent upon his brother's face, and he saw warmth in them. Suzuki knew she loved Itaka dearly, for he looked like her oldest, Mufwio, a perfect image of him save the tear lines that highlighted his vicious nature, that something had gone amiss during his rebirth, and there was nothing more precious than an untalking dead man. She would love and love and love, and, in her heart, he would love her back, always. He would say day, and it would be day. He would say night, and by the sage, it would become night for her eyes. She favored Itaka so much like his parents. With her in the council, and a long line of powerful deadkin behind her, Suzuki knew he never had a chance at the head seat. Frustration faded from his face and gave way to sadness, bitterness. Suddenly, he wanted to fly out of the room. Sitting so close to his older brother, it was making him nauseous. Trapped inside his own thoughts, he had little idea when the last vote was cast. A swell of murmurs disturbed the air, anchored by the deepest silence, and one by one, every single man left. Now, Suzuki, Itaka, and Rao were the only ones left in the room. Suzuki parted his lips to let out the anger rising when the door slid open and Izumi toddled in. She brought with herself a sharp smell of perfume and he coughed full. Suzuki's pupils thinned into slits of red, his Sharingan pulsing. He always disliked her and her wicked ways. He watched as she sat down beside Rao and lowered her eyes and head in shyness, and he could barely stop himself from mocking her. His eyes cooled off on their own. His brother gave no indication that he saw her come in, his eyes, focused on the fan patterns on the pots, his face, completely expressionless. Time slowed down to a finishing brush stroke, and Suzuki wanted to leave behind the room's claustrophobic confines. Is it done? Can I leave? He asked in a harsh voice, and his jaws clenched. That arm was still hurting him. It was secured in a cast from his shoulder to the tip of his still broken bones, bent in an L shape to mend the bones. He felt a sharp pain invade his body's domain whenever he moved it a little. Cast your vote and you may leave, Itaka spoke, turning his head a little to look at his face, shrouded in darkness. Itaka's Sharingan resurfaced, swimming up like an ugly red fish, and Suzuki knew that Itaka could see him very clearly in the dark. Suzuki looked down. A small paper was still lying in his lap. He raised his head, and his expression changed. He was angrier now. Why does it matter what I do? Most voted in your favor. Obasan's here, so she made damn sure they were going to. Why do you need my approval? He asked, his tone grating, rough. Itaka was silent. Suzuki waited for him to say something, yet when Itaka chose silence, he got to his feet and scrunched up the paper in his hand. His face showed nothing but the deepest contempt, which he had nurtured since that night in the forest. He would never forgive him for what he did to him. He loathed him. The cast of his gaze drew nothing but disgust from his every piece, every bit of his heart. Suzuki stared down at Itaka's seemingly calm eyes with a ferociousness so terrible that it surprised him that he ever loved him looked up to him. "I'm not casting any vote," he hissed, anger raw and rough in his voice, and threw the paper down at him. "Do as you please. Take this cheap harlot as your wife, too. I'm sure there will be plenty more waiting in line." A harsh, mocking smile broke out on his sallow face and it stayed there. A frown, indistinguishable from his white skin's texture, creased Itaka's face, but he did not look angry. "Suzuki, do not speak that way in front of Oba-san," he spoke, maintaining his calm. Suzuki's anger was having little effect on him, and, suddenly, Suzuki wanted to get a rise out of him, break his calm, shatter that fake mask of care and love he wore upon his face like a kabuki theater actor daily. Itaka was a charlatan, and he was no longer fond of his games. "Why, don't like my honesty? Do you want lies, Itaka?" he asked and watched, with nigh childlike satisfaction, as surprise went flickering across his brother's visage. His grandmother gasped behind her quivering, old hands. He had abandoned that barrier of respect, he had never spoken to his brother without an honorific never. "What is the matter with you? I am not asking you to vote in my favor. Do you have to behave in this manner just to get back at me?" he asked in disbelief and slowly got to his feet, and Suzuki hated it when he saw that he was still shorter than he. Short enough to carry the heavy feeling of his shadow upon him. It felt as though he could not breathe under its weight that crushed and bowed his back, and he wanted to be free. Free of him. Free of everything. Suzuki's lips started to tremble and he spoke without much restraint, "You're not my brother. I damn what you do as a head, or as a keeper of this easy whore to spawn more of yourself." Suzuki turned his face to her and saw her eyes widen with shame and shock. "Look, how eager she is to spread herself wider for you. Eager to rut and eager to lay a fitting woman for a slippery man such as yourself. You couldn't have found a more suitable match," he said coldly and without shame, returning his eyes back to him. Suzuki's fury had redoubled at the sight of her tears. He wanted to say more. He wanted to hurt him more, shame him more. So when Itaka raised his hand to strike him, he did not flinch, he did not blink. He wanted to feel the sting of his slap on his face without fear this time. He wanted to break away and tear apart what they shared. It did not matter to him, not anymore. Itaka curled his fingers. He did not hit him. He kept looking down at Suzuki's eyes, and the fury burning down the blacks to ashes in them. He lowered his hand and moved it to touch his face. Suzuki pushed his hand away and stormed out of the room. Itaka moved to try and stop him but turned around at the sound of Izumi's whimpers. He looked on as her lower lip shuddered, and she made an awful face before she started weeping. Quickly, she picked herself up and rushed out of the room. He let out a heavy sigh and sat back down. Raising his eyes to his grandmother's face, he saw a hint of a mischievous smile upon the lips. "She is foolish and sensitive," he spoke and picked up the scrunched-up paper. "Did you not tell her that he was angry? If that is all it takes to make her weep, she will not last a day in my house." He created a mildly irritated look on his face but quickly schooled his features into the expression of habitual indifference. "You could have disciplined him, Itaka, but you do nothing," she spoke in amusement and stretched her arm to stroke his hair. "I am not going to hit him over something like this when he is already ill and frail. He is angry with me. It will pass," he spoke and put the paper down on the tatami mat. The shadows stretched out before him and fell like delicate vestments on his grandmother's aged face. "And if it does not?" she asked, her voice small and soft. That smile was in place as she saw him look back at her with a glimmer of unwanted emotion in his young eyes, his eyes that hid many of his secrets. He never wanted to share them. Itaka held his gaze for a moment more and then turned his eyes away towards the lantern's flame. "As long as he is safe, then it is all right. He can hate me if he wants," he spoke with honesty and rose to stand upright. "I will go and speak with him. If he still does not want to cast his vote, you can tell the elders the truth. It matters not." He bowed before her and turned around. Then he took a few steps and opened the sliding door, but the sound of his grandmother's voice stopped him. "Will you be able to bear his hate?" she asked, looking at his back. It is easy to speak of things, Itake, but it is difficult to bear them, live through them. He has lived many years alone with you and sees you in many forms. Father, brother, a mother even. He may not know it, but it is true. He is still a child and children do not want to share. They want to be loved the most. Can you truly let him hate you, ruin his love for you, knowing that you can tell him the truth and end this quarrel? Itake half turned, his face rigid in the wind flowing in through the open door. He does not need to know. He is a child. Do not ever speak of it to him. You will only get him killed. Is that what you wish, to end his life? I would be left with nothing, he spoke, a trace of anger in his voice. Rao only smiled. Her lips quivered, smile wavered, and fresh tears rose in her eyes. You will only push him further away. Your lies will kill him. He will end up dead. He will not stop. You know this. You know, child. You have always known of his nature. How long will you keep on punishing him? How long? Tell him. He will understand, for he loves you. He will forgive you, she spoke, face anxious and anguished. My child, my beautiful child, you cannot be so naive. You cannot be. You know this will destroy him. You are destroying him, and if something happens to him, it will truly ruin you, destroy you. You will never be able to heal from his death. It will drive you mad, and I know madness. I have seen it, lived through it. Tell him. Lift this burden from your shoulders. It is a thing of the past and it has spiraled out of control. You. That is not your decision to make, he cut across her and left in silence, closing the door behind him. Leaving her alone in the darkness to weep. Itake searched for Suzuki in the manor, but Tanaka told him that he never came home. He roamed the Uchiha village till he saw him sitting under a tree, a stone in hand, thoughtlessly, he was turning it around with the fingers of his good hand. Suzuki heard the crunch of the dry leaves under his brother's sandals, and irritation came to his face. What do you want? Leave me be, he said, and his voice was still bitter. His face was turned away from Itake, and his back was pressed against the tree. A cool wind rushed past Itake, and he smiled. I came to see if you were all right, he spoke and drew closer. I'm not an invalid. I can take care of myself, he said, and threw the stone to the stream a couple of feet from him. It made a big splash and sank down. Itake looked up at the moon, it was weak and murky behind the gray. It would rain soon. You can stay angry with me, but there are precepts and we have to obey them, he spoke and watched Suzuki as he turned his face up to him. His black eyes were a little wide, and there were anger and confusion living in them, and much to Itake's dismay, they were there to stay. I don't care about your precepts, and I don't care about your demmed seed, to hell with you. Do what you please. This game you play bores me, he said, and raised himself to his feet. Itake's smile had not faded. It widened, warm and gentle, eyes glinting with delight and mischievousness. So angry. You child, he spoke with added softness and watched Suzuki's face contort and work with more anger, and you claim that you have grown up. You always mock me. Is it something Oto-sama loved in you? I could never understand him. He was strange like that, loving a wicked boy like you, he said angrily, bitterly, softly, and a pulsing vein, throbbing like a little heart, rose to the surface of his throat. Why would I mock you? He spoke and moved his hand to touch Suzuki's brow and brush his hair to the side. You are my child and no father mocks his child. And he was smiling, and his smile was not cold. Suzuki was silent. He wanted to say more, but anger stopped him. His curious eyes forgot the anger for a moment and watched Itake, making sure that it was not another trick, as Itake brushed the dry leaves off his shoulders. He pulled few out of his wind-blown hair, too. You do not want me to take the seat? Cast your vote. It would not matter to me, he spoke, stroking his head. If you do not like her, I will not accept her as my wife. Tell me what your heart wants. Suzuki sucked his cheek in a way as though he was chewing on a piece of lemon. Why are you asking me? He asked, voice still rough that Itake could not help but create a full smile on his lips. Oba-san wishes for me to get this matter out of the way. When the girl gives me a son, there is no need for her to be in my house, he spoke, meeting Suzuki's intense gaze. Suzuki, you are my child. Do not forget. No one can take your place. Even if it is my son. Do not be so angry. Look what you have done to yourself in anger. Cool your heart. I am not your foe. Itake's face was sober, and his black eyes were searching his face, his mind. You have a way with words, Suzuki said, and he did not look any less angry, unmoved by his brother's words that he thought to be charmless. They all like what you tell them, but I know that you're a liar. You always have been. His face shivered, and a softer anger clung to his lips the way red sake does. Itake did not speak. It was better to leave him be for now. Moments passed and Suzuki spoke again, his voice calmer now. I want to visit the police force compound. That day is coming. I want to pray where I was found. It would be. What are you speaking of? Itake cut him off with a changed voice and gaze. Suzuki looked up and found confusion and a little anger in Itake's face. What do you mean? I want to visit the compound. Even that isn't allowed under your eye? The votes haven't even been counted yet, but look at you, full of yourself already. He said firmly. He was quick to anger over the matters that were closest to his heart. Itake considered Suzuki for a moment, fixing him with a strange look. Suzuki, you were not found in the compound, he spoke and tilted his head a little to the left. Softness faded from his eyes, and he looked quite cold again. Why the fuck do you act like this? Do you find these tricks amusing? I don't, Suzuki said with a hiss, and his cheek muscles tightened in fury. What have you been brewing up in your head? He asked and moved closer. Show me. And before Suzuki could protest, Itake was inside his mind. It was night, and he was not wearing one sandal, his tiny foot bare whilst he sloshed through blood that was black as his brother's scroll ink. He fell down to his knees when his eyes fell upon someone's face, and everything turned to black. Itake withdrew from his brother's mind and blinked once, his shurikens spinning quite obediently in his eyes. You child, he spoke, and his words hurt like the snow. How I stop you from dwelling on this for too long, yet you do not listen. You are so fixated on this that you are tampering with your memories. Is this how you want to live your life, pushing yourself to the brink of sanity? Itake grabbed him by the arm and jerked him forward. He was so angry now. Is this another one of your stories? I haven't read anything like this. You're lying. I don't believe you. Suzuki looked back, face locked stiffly by his eyes' intensity. Not everything related to the Sharingan is made available to a boy, he spoke, and his lips trembled into a smile that released anger's surges into Suzuki's eyes. It boiled his blood. Who knows what troubles you will create with kinjutsus in your reach, let alone any other details of the Sharingan. He stopped and slowly shook his head, still a disobedient child. You are creating another mess for me, but you do not care as you told me in the forest. You do not owe me a thing, as it is, somehow, my duty to keep cleaning up your messes. Does this not terrify you? Do you not fear insanity? Itake's face was hard and angry, his eyes two bright rubies in the dark. Suzuki was silent, his eyes were wide whilst he tried to pull away, but Itake's grip was too tight for his present strength. That anger rose back up to the surface, his cheeks red and hot again. He searched his mind, but he could remember nothing from that night other than that broken memory. Suddenly, Itake let go of his arm, and Suzuki took a step back and lowered his eyes to escape his accursed gaze. I will take you to the compound, but on one condition. He paused, an uncompromising look still present in his face like something permanent and eternal. You will not go there for another year, and you will come to me every night to fix this. I cannot bear another burden, not with a new responsibility on my shoulders. You are creating a great trouble for yourself. If someone catches wind of this, you child. He clenched his jaws and looked away. I don't understand. Suzuki fell silent. He dropped his gaze to the ground, eyes looking at the red flowers quivering under the caresses of the autumn breeze. You were lost deep in the forest, he spoke, and his voice drew Suzuki's gaze to him. You went after autumn moths that were floating to purple lilies. You pursued them. You were a small child. It took me hours to find you. I thought. He stopped, but his voice did not falter and he continued, You perished in the massacre, but you had collapsed in the field of lilies from exhaustion when you could not find your way back home. You never saw anything. Do not do this. You will ruin yourself. And me. Words eluded Sasuke. He knew his chakra was strong, he knew Uchiha chakra leaked into the brain. Was he so consumed by vengeance that he was meddling with his own head, his memories? A part of him did not believe Itachi, not one bit. You never should trust a liar. Itachi turned around to walk away, but he stopped and spoke as coldly as he had before. I will cast your vote and consider it a no, but you are honest. He paused and looked over his shoulder. It matters not. And then he walked away, leaving Sasuke outside in the night's air. Chapter 42, Truth or Dare. With that perpetual condition of unwanted irritation apparent on his face, Sasuke looked into the distance, eyes searching to the east, beyond the mist's ghost strips. His Sharingan was out, and it did not seem as though he wanted to look her way. Only weeks had come to pass, yet she felt that something inside her had cooled off against her will. Longing flared up, but it did not sink back down. It rose, and she did not feel any shame in letting her imaginations run wild and free. They carved their own course in that dirt road of her mind, and she felt a smile crawl across her face. Rain was cool on her cheeks and neck, but she felt warm and nice. He had a Sharingan, but he did not possess the instrument to read her mind, not like that. She fumbled and bit her lip in irritation, for he always made her vulnerable. Breathing in deeply, she cleared the haze in her head to speak again, her voice no less timid this time. I have to complete the mission in the allotted tea time. What if I'm unable to? Hinata asked, feeling the veins overfill themselves with much warmth that she heard every pulse in her body loud and clear. He did not stir for some moments, head bent, eyes on his hand. He kept curling and uncurling his fingers. A wince crossed his features every time he did so. He had not fully healed from his injuries. Complete your task and come back in a couple of minutes, he said coldly, cheeks red, decorations of freezing ire and autumn. Hinata did not like his tone. It had been weeks since she had last seen him. She did not enjoy his tamed wrath, she did not deserve it. She huffed out a sigh, and her face worked into an expression of discontent, too. Red responded and flooded her cheeks, and she curled her right hand and pressed it against her breast. Her heart was not quiet, no, it was loud and furious. You could tell me some more. What would happen if you fail? Sasuke silenced her, his head turning sharply to her, his teeth clenching as tightly as stones in a pathway. He looked very angry. You'll be sent home. Is that good enough, or do you want to be coddled some more? Anger flew from her eyes, only to return with a new intensity. Why are you angry? It isn't fair, Sasuke, she said, face turning to hide her emotions, and she felt many of them, attacking her all at once. You're so direct with me, he said in a low, guttural voice, veins knotting on his brow. I'm your superior. Intimacy shouldn't fill your head with air. Come down to the ground. It'll do you good. The shame his brother put him through danced naked in his mind, wilder than his fires. He hated him, loathed him, his contempt for him exceeding his mind's limits. Any disturbance proved to be too much for his senses. Hinata stepped back, eyes growing round like an owl's. Her face turned deep red, still filling with disbelief. Her mind groped through a maelstrom of desire, anger, memory. He was not being fair. She had given him her heart, she told him of that. It felt hurtful to be at the receiving end of his whiplash. I don't, Hinata whispered and swallowed back the lump of anger coming up to her throat to choke her. I don't deserve this. You shouldn't talk to me this way. It isn't fair. Why you aren't being fair? Her face, covered in layers of contained anger, showed blotches of light and shade, and she did not let her eyes wander anywhere. They were bent on his face, and he did not seem moved. Life isn't fair. Not all things have to go your way, he said and shoved his hands into his pockets, his head turning almost dismissively. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Don't be you unfair to me, don't. She shouted, and he stared back indifferently, jaws clenching tightly, eyes swirling with emotions turbulent. Sasuke drew in a deep breath and faced her, his countenance, still rigid. What do you want? I'm in no mood for this emotional show of yours. And Isama's already breathing down my neck to cut you loose. I can't handle you and Naruto both. If it's between you and him, I will drop you if you don't perform, he said, sounding rough and uncaring, every muscle in his face tight. Nothing she said seemed to soften his anger. Hinata stared back, and defeat, familiar and fearsome, returned to her face, and she looked down, letting herself be distracted by the many-colored leaves sinking in the mud. Of course, she breathed out and smiled a bitter smile, of course you would choose him. He's your friend. No be barrier trust and kindness, it's all meant for him. You're unfair, and you're cruel. She swallowed up her tears and did not let grief devour her. Are you a fucking kid? Don't quarrel with me. Naruto has nothing to do with this. You all have ruined his life as it is, he said, his eyes meeting hers, gazing at shock permeate her cold-nipped face, slowly. Yet again, her expression changed and anger won over and consumed her. Her hands curled into fists, body shaking, emotions striking her heart's core. How could you say that to me? She asked in a voice that was quite unlike the one she was familiar with, and her eyes grew wider with shock. For years, I've suffered at his hands. He was unkind to me. He never cared about me. He left me for days to rot in that house. No one came for me, but what would you know? Your brother loves you so much. You don't know anything. You. And her words faded under the loud bark of Sasuke's laughter. His head was tilted, and he laughed and laughed as though it was the most amusing thing in the world. At last, Sasuke's laughter faded and his eyes slowly opened, his long white throat vibrating under the drizzle with repressed sounds. His breast heaved rapidly for few moments before he quieted his loud breaths and sighed. Then, as though something had passed, he looked at her face. She was so shocked that he could not help but create a smile on his face. His eyes began to sparkle with a frightening emotion that made her shiver. What did she say wrong? Almost distracted by dusk's coming, he looked upon the red that spread over the horizon for a moment more before he spared her the cast of his cold glance. You don't know anything about my brother. Mind your own business, he said, with not an ounce of kindness, tapped at the side of his head, and stared at her up and down as he passed his tongue over his lips, a little thoughtlessly. Naruto? He's a fucking child, but you're so damn sure of yourself that you must put him down. You're a fool. Amusement seemed to have vanished from his face, like a nightly ghost at daybreak. It was like something Hinata said that created a sting on his skin and hurt him raw. Her words had angered him and she did not know why. She looked at him and he back at her, and her heart could not bear that he was going further and further away from her. Her resolve struck her mind into action, and she wanted to trip forward and grab hold of his hand, yell at him, make him hers, so she looked at him with much curiosity, and her eyes tried to cut through the mists between them. His face did not relate rigid self-control and detached coolness like Itaka's, no, he had his own passions to exhibit, but he blew hot and cold. She did not know what to do about him, about herself. Time was slipping away from her like he, and she had no wish to let go just yet. It was too soon to part from him, too soon. It's the truth. You're only siding with your friend. It's his fault, she said breathlessly and grasped at her breast as if to control and calm her jumping heart. Why didn't you leave? He asked and tilted his head and focused his red eyes on her face, and, quite suddenly, he looked interested like a little boy as to what she would say, his anger forgotten. Hinata blinked, and her face suddenly went blank. Then she raised her eyebrows, widened her eyes, and showed her teeth, grimacing. Where could I have gone? Why you talk like I ever had a home to go to, she said, fully resentful, and turned her gaze away. Her father came into her thoughts, and she felt that, deep in her heart, she had always loathed him. Your father loves his gold, he said, smiling. His gold. Hinata repeated, feeling angered and humiliated by his words. I'm his wife. He did me no favors by caring for me. I've done all that I can as his wife. I have. He told me that you weren't kind to him. Sasuke cut her off, his warm breaths hung in the air before fading away right before her eyes. He was cornered by your father and his parents to give every penny he earned to all of you, but what the fuck would I know? You're both a handful. He widened and then narrowed his eyes, smiling an odd smile, one which exhibited his childlike curiosity. Hinata was silent. His words struck her, and she raised her hand to rub at her cheeks as though she could feel the sting on her skin. Her mind wandered, and she looked through every memory, and it occurred to her. She never spoke to him when he came back after many days and nights. He used to smile when they got married. Then, little by little, his smiles vanished and he talked less and less till he stopped coming home. He would disappear for days after lectures from Hayashi and his parents. They always admonished him, belittled him for not giving them an heir. He tried, but the pain terrified her so much that she did not ever let him come near her. As time went on, he did not ask her for intimacy. He became cold and detached. He stopped caring. I had to lend him money. You all trapped him to get an heir at all costs. It's not a matter of fairness, it's cruel, he whispered, his face changing this time to exhibit his displeasure. He had enough to enjoy himself. For 4 years, he was intimate with someone else. At least, he had something. At least, he wasn't rotting away all alone like I was, Hinata said and her voice faltered. It's easy for you to say this because you're a man. You wouldn't understand. You wouldn't. Naruto's a fool, but he didn't go near Sakura till about a year ago, Sasuke said and his words shocked her again. He was lying, this could not be true. That's a lie. Don't lie to me. People told me. People. She broke off and stifled a sob, her eyes red with fresh tears that burnt along her cheeks. She gulped in the air to cool off the sensation, and that eased her pain just a bit. No, it's the truth, he said, smiling again. People say many things. People lie. Naruto never touched Sakura till last year. He told me. He was bitter. He hated his life with you. He wanted to shame his parents. He hoped that this would make them free him, but they're persistent. Without their support, he'd be on the streets. Beggars can't be choosers. That stupid fucker. He looked up, drawing in the air deeply, amused as all heck. Thunder shrieked and lightning streaked in the sky, but blood talked louder in Hinata's ears. He was lying. He had to be lying. She mashed her trembling lips together and swallowed down her sobs. Then she closed her eyes against the bites of tears, but the pain in her heart haunted her. She had broken apart her own life? No, it could not be. She bent her head to hide away her shame. She did not know what to say. Nothing tripped from her tongue, it was shy again. He could have spoken to me. He could have. She choked on the words. They were scratching at her throat, burning it, hurting it. It was all anger and shame and sorrow. All was lost, years of her life, lost. Sasuke did not say anything and turned his eyes to look at the lightning that ran across the sky like a sacred animal. He seemed almost bored. It broke up into many blue forks up north. The sky lit up and a loud noise followed, and then it was silence again. Hinata felt her feet move, and before she could stop herself, she was standing before him. Her face tilted up to look at him and his red eyes that she had learned to love so much. He shouldn't have gone near her. She paused and took in sharp breaths in an attempt to calm down the distressed heart that hit at her spirit. He shouldn't have. You don't know how it has shamed me. His infidelity. His coldness. You don't know. It's easy for you to say this to me, but why Yuri, not me? You're not me. He shouldn't have gone near her. He's still a terrible man. And no matter what you say, it doesn't change that. You're the same, no? He asked, voice like the breeze, and her eyes went wide. You asked me to cheer you up. Many times. You liked it, too. Why do you only find fault in him? I don't find fault in you. His eyes narrowed, but he looked calm, playful even. That anger had fled from him, and she was secretly glad. Don't say that, she said, anguished and without a breath, and moved her hands to take hold of his. Don't say that. You hurt me. Your words hurt me. Sasuke was silent, ears filling up with the pleasant sounds from storm and forest. His skin was cold like the wind, and his heart was just as cold. His anger got the best of him today, but she came through regardless. She was easy, naive, weak. His brother was wicked as hell, but he had not made a mistake in seeing right through her. Hinata pulled his hand to herself and placed it gently upon her breast. He sensed her heart leaping up underneath her wet jacket at his touch. It craved his touch. Her eyes were closed, lashes fluttering, face serene. Her long hair swayed behind her in the wind. Pink invaded the white of her skin, and when she opened her eyes, she looked free and enamored. "Don't hurt me," she sighed out, more sweetly this time, and squeezed his hand in hers. "I was alone and I had no one and I'm not ashamed of what I did. If Kami gave me another chance, I'll do it again. I'm not ashamed to love you. I won't be ashamed." She moved forward, hands on each side of his wet face, and she leaned up to kiss him. Hinata started with his lips as her hands reached to the back of his head. Her fingers tangled in his messy hair. Almost hesitant to answer her entreaty, his lips opened slightly in response, and she was quick to avail this moment. His mouth was warm, tongue hot against hers. Lust vibrated in her like music, and she wanted him to take her on the leaf-covered ground, feed her passion, appease her lust, burn her body the way she enjoyed. There was this insistent pressure of her pink lips against his jaw and his throat as she tried to desperately tug him down into the violent storm of her cravings. She pulled back suddenly and whispered again, "I'm not ashamed." Then she moved further back, her eyes still on his. She kept moving back till she stopped in the sunrays, which played with her as delicately as children, and stood silently a few feet from him. Exhausted and fed up of it all, Suzuki sat down on the fallen tree and rubbed at his eyes. He was tired. "Go and complete the task. Catch the man in the forest in 10 minutes and bring him back. If you don't complete this in time, Nii-sama will be angry me. I'm in no mood for his lectures today," he said, head bowed as he kept looking down at the glinting grass, garbed in mist-kissed dews. Hinata nodded and disappeared from sight, and he created a happy childlike smile, which was void of warmth, behind her back. "Your report is 30 minutes late," Itaka spoke whilst he sat in Suzuki's office chair. He had decided to scold him here this time. "Why do you always want me to spoil you, Suzuki?" Suzuki stood under his shadow, which was a strange creation of Lights and Night's union. Devil's spawn, how the fuck did his innocent mother conceive this monster? His wild demeanor had lost itself in these last few days behind fear's armor that was heavy enough that he wanted to cast it from his flesh as quickly as possible. He figured that his injuries flared his anger. Now that his body was nearly healed, his heart shuddered, as if from a violent crash, whenever his eyes fell upon Itaka. His body was afraid of getting hurt. He was afraid that Itaka would hurt him again. All that audacity, all that boldness, was gone. Vanished. He was vulnerable again. "Do you want an invitation to tell me the details?" Itaka asked as coldly as he could have and pressed his fingers to his temples. She twisted her foot in the mud. "I had to take her to the infirmary. She doesn't know how to write a report. It took a while for me to guide her," Suzuki said, and his words barely managed to conceal his fierce presence. "How unfortunate for the discarded Hyuga girl. Is she not a little clumsy? Her family washed their hands clean of her, yet you adore having her as an extra playmate. We should all abide by your charitable decisions to embrace lonely married women. Her family's unhappiness be damned." He spoke and a smile came to his face. Suzuki was silent. "She hasn't been in the squad for long. You know this," he said, irritation obscured by his gravel tone. His head bent, and he stood with his hands clasped behind his back in obedient posture, his knuckles white as seashells. Itaka did not answer and looked at his younger sibling for a moment longer and opened the report. His face was slightly tight, the expression of his countenance irritated, his red eyes shining like his father's lanterns in the dark. He read it in 2 heartbeats. Then his frown deepened, and he rolled up the scroll. He let out a soft sking sound when he saw his crow sitting in the window. It vanished after a single unpleasant caw. "Congratulations. She barely managed to scrape a win this time. I feel luckless, yet you should be ecstatic, delirious with joy that you had your way again." Itaka spoke and his deep, mocking voice hurt Suzuki's senses. Itaka rose to his feet and made his way to him, eyes wandering in Suijutsu's direction, who stood silently by the window, away from Suzuki. His head was bowed, as well. Itaka stopped, and his shadow sluiced down one half of Suzuki's entire body, and he wanted to shrink away. I want you in my chamber in 20 minutes to fix your addled head. Do you understand my words? Or make no mistake, child, you will be in trouble. With this new responsibility on my shoulders, I have no time for your every whim. They seem to increase day by day. I agreed to this sage-forsaken mission as Hirchin application had gone through without my knowledge. Consider yourself lucky that it reached the Hokage before me. A miracle, though I am sure you had a hand in its creation. I hope she takes careful steps in the coming days, or I will make certain that you are remorseful for wasting my time." He spoke thickly, an air of threat about him, and left the office with a graceful gait. Suzuki's eyes glowed on his face in the wake of his brother's leaving. This night, his eternal eyes were out, and he pushed a heavy amount of chakra inside them to look into every nook and corner in the office. He saw it all, a spider in the deep crack, rats scrambling into the holes, frantic, and a snake down in the wiring. No one was here save him and Suijitsu. He could see his brother walking away from the office. His chakra was exquisite, beautiful, powerful. He felt a surge of emotion, a sense of pride. He was his brother, after all. He was perfect. The thought did not stay and got shattered by his anger, albeit he forgot. His pulses remembered his older sibling's cruelty, and his eyes cooled and he blinked. Suijitsu was smiling. He was as mischievous as ever. "You have a big mouth," Suzuki said, quieted the red, and turned a little to look at him. Without Sherry Non, he could barely make out the outline of Suijitsu's face, shadows and starless night, thick and mingling. "Did it to save your life?" "I didn't know ya brother'll beat ya senseless," he said and chuckled. "Ya didn't call me here to talk about the beatin' and the hugs ya want. Come on, what's eatin' ya? Ya tell me purty friend." His smile was widening, and his teeth were showing. They were so white and clean that he could easily see them in the haziness about him. "What else did Kisuk tell you?" Suzuki asked and closed his eyes to feel the breeze hit his hot skin. His brother's words had set his blood to boiling like that old cauldron in their house's kitchen. He used to poke at it with a stick as a child, often. "A cunt fram root's been comin' over in that shady place in rain to meet with Mist Mutts. He said he saw a ol' loiterin' bout there, too. The greasy arsehole still ain't happy. He's sniffin' round about me," he explained and took a single step forward to come out from the shadows. "Abarame Torun," Suzuki paused, arrogance tearing through his blank face, and he smiled. "Abarame, still like insects. They can't help but crawl into Root's lap in hopes of gaining something for their clan. He must have a middleman. Find him, kill him, and make your clone take his place. I want this done soon." Suzuki's eyes, all-consuming with a wild hunger for revenge, began to shine brightly. That Suijitsu smiled. "Ya want me to lure him out?" "Won't be easy," Suijitsu said and crossed his arms. The silver light from moon made his watery body more obvious. He glowed in the dark with a strange aura about him. Spread a rumor about Kisame among few leaf-hired shinobis there. Mist will be wary. They have peace treaty meetings coming up. I read May's mind last time. The news won't reach her that soon. Make haste. The sooner we get this done, the better. I want to know what that whelp knows," Suzuki said, tone abrasive, expression touched by resolve, imparting to his face a wild luster. "What about ya brother?" he asked, looking a bit shocked. "Ya took a beatin' a demmed nasty one, too. Ain't it too soon to jump back into this? Think about it, Suzuki. Don't be too hasty." Suzuki ran his teeth across his bottom lip. He suddenly looked amused. "Nii-sama has a lot on his plate," he said and gave a little laugh as though he was enjoying himself. "Between Umbu, his head responsibilities, and a foolish woman he needs to handle for an heir, I doubt he'd suspect this. My brother's clever, perfect, but he's human. He has his limits. He's exhausted these days. It's amusing to see him struggle with all this. He'd never expect me to start something so soon, not after what he did." And Suijitsu could see teeth in his sinister smile. He looked bitter, angry, happy. "Ya gotta hearin' tomorrow. Ya remember that, don't ya?" Suijitsu asked with a curious smile. He watched as Suzuki's eyes glowed redder, and his lips stretched wider into a delightful smile that made him shiver. He could not believe that Itaka's beating had only made him more stubborn, more angry. "Nii-sama told me last night that he loves me," he said in a manner that it sounded like mockery. "Let him worry about that. Nothing will happen. You do as you're told. A treaty signing with Cloud's happening soon. He'd be busy. We can use that time to kill Torin and get the information he knows. Once I get that, I can deal with Nii-sama. You worry too much, Suijitsu, you fool." Suzuki walked away from him and stood by the window. Suijitsu kept staring at his back. Itaka would find out, and both of them would be in great trouble. He knew it. It was a gut feeling, but he just knew. Chapter 43, The Hearing. The council hall was empty save one attendant who marched back and forth with a stack of scroll papers in her arms. The soles of her sandals were thick and created ear-splitting, echoing sounds as she clumsily toddled back and forth between various desks. The wooden floor was over-polished and squeaky clean. Suzuki's bored eyes followed her movements from left to right and then back again. Her sandals were slipping on the floor, and it was only a matter of time before she tripped, and it happened just as he had predicted. She spun around too quickly, her leg flying up, and she landed very hard on her rump. The scrolls flew out of her hands, and all the papers slowly floated down about her. Her thick glasses were left askew on her pink face. An embarrassed smile formed on her lips, and it widened comically till the tips of her front teeth peeked out. She muttered something and hurriedly began to pick up the pages. Suzuki dragged his eyes away and pressed the crook of his knuckle to his lips to hold in the laughter. He sat on a waiting bench by the thick double door on his right. The door had an intricate leaf pattern carved into its smooth surface. It gave off a very faint odor of damp rot that choked him when the breeze moved it. The thing was probably as much of a relic as the council members were. Lazily, he moved his gaze to the window. It was left half open to let in fresh morning air. Sun was still climbing up the eastern slope of clear sky. It was only 6 a.m. in the morning, and the offices were empty. He wiggled his ears, hoping to catch a faint sound from beyond the door. It was no use. He could hear nothing from inside the large hall. He imagined they had placed some sort of sound-repelling seals on the walls and doors to make it soundproof. Suzuki sighed and leaned back against the wall. Itaki had told him to wait obediently in the waiting area. He had a small matter to attend, so he waited silently and obediently like his older sibling had told him to. He now settled his eyes upon Yu's impatient hands. He was rubbing them together and looking quite nervous. Yu stood with his back to the wall, eyes on the floor, glancing slightly to the left and slightly to the right. His eyes were wide, and there was sweat on his young face. He looked more worried than Suzuki about the hearing. At that moment, measured steps sounded on the floor and his brother came into view, with Kai and Seriza right behind him. Yu's eyes bulged out, and he quickly stood as straight as an arrow, every muscle tensed, and he bowed his head to fumble out a shaky morning greeting. Itaka did not answer it. Suzuki slowly got to his feet and turned his head away. He did not want to see his brother. That anger was still there, and his body burnt with a barely controlled fury. Itaka stopped and turned his eyes to Yu. "You may leave and manage Suzuki's squad," Itaka spoke, his eyes moving towards Suzuki's countenance, and watched, with slight amusement, the changing expression on his face and a frown developing on his brow. Yu bowed again and asked, "When will his hearing be over, Itaka-sama?" "He has to manage team tests today." Then he began rubbing his hands together again, letting them apart and bringing them together like some kind of ritual. Itaka looked at his hands for a moment and then brought his gaze back to his face again. He will not find the time for duty today. He has to return home after this to welcome a guest, he spoke, and Suzuki's lips compressed in a tight expression, eyes narrow, but he did not say a word. Yu gave a quick bow and left, his steps deadened by the progressive increase in distance till Suzuki could hear him no more. He turned his eyes and watched the cool look on Kai's features and the warm smile on Serizawa's. His smile widened when Suzuki's eyes met his, but he quickly directed his eyes to the floor in a stubborn attempt to evade his brother's gaze. He knew who was coming, and he knew Itaki had done it on purpose to teach him another lesson in obedience. At this moment, his resentment grew stronger. He felt his brother's hand on his shoulder and heard and felt the brushing of his hand against the Jonin jacket. He was trying to wipe away a speck of dirt. I have faith in you that you will not say anything I did not ask of you to memorize last night. He spoke, voice smooth, and a sudden ripple of anger crossed Suzuki's face, but he stayed quiet. Do not speak unless you are not spoken to, he spoke, adjusting the zip of Suzuki's flak jacket as if he was a wee boy who did not know how to dress for the Genin Academy, and do not speak anything more than what is necessary. As long as you stay silent and obey, you will be out of here in a matter of minutes. Suzuki raised his eyes a bit to look at a smile hovering over Itaka's lips like a sinister specter. He grabbed the back of Suzuki's neck and squeezed. Do you understand? He asked and raised his finger when Suzuki parted his lips to retort. I want none of your lip today, none of your wild nature and your child's play. Leave them outside this door when you step inside the hall. The smile softened impish upon his brother's face. He loved to wear it often these days. Suzuki knew this was another one of his pretend plays. The man was a mystery to him. He was brought up by him. He grew up playing on his lap and sleeping in the same futon with him when he was but a boy, yet he could never say for certain that he knew him. Itaka still loved to make the origami cranes for him. He did that often when he was young, too. It used to fascinate Suzuki how quickly he would fold the paper and create a perfect crane in a matter of seconds. It was a childhood pleasure that had lost a bit of its attraction and charm. Over the years, most things did. The look of anger faded a little from his face, and he lowered his head lost in thoughts. You are a good boy, you are such a good boy. I know that you will not disappoint me, Itaka spoke in a voice that sounded almost sincere and brushed his fingers across Suzuki's forehead. Then Itaka pulled his hand back, moved away, and opened the thick door. Then voices came to him, loud voices, but the door was quickly shut behind Itaka. Don't test my patience, old fool. Tsunade snarled loudly at Danzo, slapping her hand down on the large table that glasses and brush and pen holders danced. Her brown eyes flashed to Itaka, and she fell silent. Itaka moved his eyes around the room slowly, taking in every detail. It was a large, but sparsely furnished, room. Lanterns sat on the long and large table set before 7 big chairs. Tsunade sat on the largest one right in the middle. Shimura Danzo, Mito Kato Homura, and Yuditen Koharu sat on her right whilst Nara Shikaku and Hyaga Hayashi sat on her left. There was one empty chair, and it was reserved for him. Ah, Itaka, we thought you'd lost your way here, Shikaku said from across the large room, a broad smile on his mildly scarred face. His voice seemed to almost echo in the hall. Itaka slowly climbed the small set of stairs that led to the hefty chair placed next to Tsunade's. I had a matter to attend, he spoke and sat down on the chair, eyes on the empty chair on the floor in front of them. It was placed right under a lantern hanging down from the high roof. It glowed eerily, but the space around it was cast in shadows. Today, there were no shackles attached to it. He raised his eyes a little to look at the roof. It was dark there, and he could see nothing without his sherry on. I was called this morning to handle that mist matter, he Shikaku, twisting his beard. Who's the shinobi that has to appear before us? Uchiha Suzuki, Itaka spoke expressionlessly, without turning his face to look back at him, and the smile flew from Shikaku's lips at the expression of such dutiful detachment upon Itaka's face. Shikaku gave a sidelong glance to the empty chair and pulled in a breath deeply, his eyes appraising the wooden object as though it was already occupied by Suzuki. Curiosity, and a bit of sorrow, came to his eyes. He was a middle-aged man who had seen it all, ugliness and carnage of wars and cunning of shinobis who thronged the military ranks, eager to please their lords. It was always some unlucky bastard that got caught in the whispers and murmurs of treachery. The council was always swift to do away with the lot of them. They were swift, emotionless, and cruel, too cruel, but Suzuki. It did not seem right. When Shikaku was young, he did not understand how anything mattered beyond the will of fire. It was absolute to a shinobi. Leaf's will was his will. Leaf rustled in uncertain winds and he, too, felt the tremors of unrest and betrayals. He set himself to seek the truth, but it was always shrouded in the changing, shifting darkness. He could not say he had a single memory that comforted him that justice was served. It made waves of guilt and shame move through him, affect his heart in ways that he felt. Sorrow over what he had done over the years. How culpable was he in Leaf's schemes? He could not say anything with certitude. He pulled in another great breath and took a moment to regroup his scattered senses and fixed his eyes on Itaka's face. He was young, Too young to be a part of the elders' council, his cheeks, still very soft, and there was not a line, not a groove in his youthful face, countenance and limbs, in the blush of youth and eyes, a blaze of wild virility. He was too young, ripened before his time by Leaf's treacherous summers, young enough to not wear nature's unfairness on his face and body. It would take them many, many years to wither away under nature's kisses. It was his time to taste lush fruits, relish pleasures of youth. Young, so young, to be tainted by Leaf's darker half, but she had bitten Itaka when he was still blooming into a man, and her corruption had gone deep into his heart and spirit. There was no saving him now. Itaka now occupied Minato's chair. The shame had taken that authority, that chair from him. It was lamentable, but it was not as though Shikaku could have changed the council's mind. They were hell-bent on making Minato suffer over that incident. Shikaku's vote amounted to nothing. It was 4 against 2. Minato was voted off the council's seat, disgraced, and his tale was over in these halls. Shikaku closed his eyes, breathed in the faint odor of fresh wood mixed with the fragrance of polish the new table and chairs exuded. They were new amongst the old folk in this room. Old, save for Itaka. I remember Sasuke, Shikaku began, and his voice unnaturally swelled in the room again, such a brilliant boy. My son always spoke highly of him. I'm sure it's some misunderstanding. He cupped his chin and played with his beard again. He had never grown a mustache. His wife found this look lovely on him. He was not a sentimental man, but he liked to do little things for his better half. We need to speak to the boy first, Kohira spoke in a shrill, grave voice. No need to give him special treatment, for his brother sits amongst us. She raised her nose in the air, those beady little eyes half open that the onlookers would not have been able to tell whether she was asleep or awake. Shikaku stole a quick glance at Itaka again. He was silent, his eyes still thoughtfully fixed on the chair. The young man was apt at hiding his emotions. If he felt anything for his brother's dire situation, he did not let it become apparent on his countenance. He smiled. Itaka had earned his seat well, though Itaka's delicate appearance did not give a truer impression of his demeanor. He was well liked amongst the Fire's military councilmen for being a hardliner and a nigh fanatical supporter of Leaf's dogma, a shrewd, hard-headed, uncompromising man in Leaf's matters. Shikaku's smile fluttered again. It would be an interesting trial. Don't be uncompromising when the hearing has yet to begin, Koharu, Tsunade said harshly. Her cheeks were beginning to redden all over again in fury. Tsunade-hime, you are still a new Hokage, Homura spoke and narrowed his eyes behind the glasses against the lantern's sharp light. Such matters are not resolved with sentimentality. Also, we believe. Bring the boy in, Tsunade cut him off loudly without looking at him. Homura pressed his lips together, his mouth a thin trembling line. He looked offended, though he had no warm blood in his veins to make his cheeks blush with the embarrassment he felt. He was a very old man now. The only guard standing next to the door opened it and gestured Sasuke to come in. It had been years since Shikaku last saw Sasuke, and as the light flooded upon him, he saw him clearly now. He had grown up into a tall and very handsome young man. Shikaku moved his eyes from Itaka's face to Sasuke's, and he could not help himself from thinking that they looked quite alike. There were little errors on Sasuke's face that made him look different from his older brother, mistakes made by nature's able hands, silly mistakes. Nature, too, stumbled sometimes. Sasuke quietly sat down, widened his thighs, and rested his arms on the broad armrests, a very relaxed posture, ill-suited for the hearing, yet his fearless nature made Shikaku smile. He raised his head and looked boldly back at the council. Shikaku found his demeanor almost thrilling to watch. Light dimmed above his head, and the room fell silent. Tsunade began writing on a scroll. The sounds magnified. Even a single draw of breath rang loudly in the room. She puffed out a loud sigh and knotted her young fingers together. Her jutsu always kept her young and beautiful. She narrowed her eyes upon Sasuke, and he looked straight back at her eyes, without an ounce of fear and shame. Uchiha Sasuke, you know why you are here? She asked, slightly bending her head forward as if she could not see him clearly. Yes, he replied in a flat tone of voice, but the emptiness in the room did not let him hide that thread of audacity. The light from the lantern made the clever glint in his eyes more obvious. Shikaku observed him with a peculiar countenance. The young man was not yet honed by age the way it had changed his older brother. Time had crafted a sinister shinobi out from the older one, a singular killer. That hard touch of time and killings had robbed that one of the innocent softness Suzuki's face had yet to relinquish. He was like a babe in comparison. The more Shikaku looked at him, the more he looked like a sweet little boy who would be incapable of misdeeds, though his body was lusty and lithe, like that of a young shinobi's his age. His arrogance was a foreign malady upon his countenance, which was sweeter than the sweetest fruit in spring. Strange little boy. Two brothers set apart by time, duty, belief. It was interesting to watch another one of these political charades in the ominous walls. They were not hallowed, and, bathed as they were with invisible streaks throughout the ages, he thought them to be almost evil. Many left this hall to their deaths. To call this boy for a hearing over something so trivial, what was Danzo thinking? Shikaku's eyebrows rose when Tsunade snapped at Koharu again, telling her to let her speak. He admired her will to limit the hold of these people. Only the sage knew how terrible their natures were. They were militant by nature. He never admired their single-minded pursuit to limit democracy in Leaf. They needed to be dealt with. Perhaps Tsunade would be the leader to change the political climate in Konoha. Minato tried, but he was ousted too soon from power. Another game Danzo played and won. Why did you accept an S-rank mission from the cage of another village? She asked, but her voice bounced off the walls like a beast's voice that was shrill. Her face was pink, mouth hard, face set in cold determination. She was not going to let them win today, and it pleased Shikaku. It wasn't an S-rank mission when I took it, Suzuki said, and kept his eyes on her. He did not let his gaze waver and find his brother's eyes. There was no need for it. It wasn't? Whatever do you mean, young man? Shikaku asked and watched as his lips twisted into a provocative smile. The boy was quite clever, yet still pure and innocent. No matter how hard he tried, he could not hide away the suggestion of childlike unease in his smile. The briefest glimmer of something sinister in Suzuki's eyes caught Shikaku's gaze, but, like his face, he did not need to plumb their depths. Suzuki did not have the years nor the sins for them. Yes, he answered and turned his eyes to Shikaku. When the mission came to me through the usual channels, it was a B-rank mission. I asked for the Umbu commander's approval. He authorized it. That's all. That's quite peculiar, Shikaku said, heaving a sigh. A B-rank mission turned out to be an S-rank one? It seems to me that Mist is playing political games to create troubles again. They like to clean up their messes through other villages. Nothing unheard of. Ending the hearing so soon? Homura asked and leaned back into his chair, his eyes roaming on Suzuki's cold face. His face managed to imitate that expression effortlessly. Do not be so lenient, Shikaku. Well, I don't see any reason why this boy would take to conspire against Leaf. Why else would he do this? Danzo's sinister voice shot anger through Suzuki like a stab of blade, but he forced it down and looked at him straight in the eye. His Sharingan was not clever to hide away his fury. It peeked through his eyes windows of spirit. A gasp rose from Shikaku and Hayashi. They were shocked at his accusation. Ah, to be so audacious as to flash your Sharingan at the council member? How shameful, young Uchiha. Koharu spoke in voice that wavered as if that red filled her with indignation. Her jowls quivered with the slightest of movements. She was a frail-looking old woman. Suzuki looked back into her eyes calmly. The fires on his face were not snuffed out. She knotted her shivering fingers into a mighty fist as though she meant to strike him down for his insolence, but, before she could speak out again, Itaki intervened. He is young. He does not yet know how to conceal his anxiety. Perhaps you should discipline him, Itaki, she spoke. Her voice had not yet lost that undercurrent of ready-made authority. This show of boldness is unacceptable when he is charged with a grave crime. Then grant him the punishment that befits his crime, as you seem to have proven his guilt, Itaki spoke, his voice hitting Suzuki hard from all sides. Perhaps pluck his eyes out in the process, as a little glow of Sharingan in a mere boy's eyes is enough to topple the establishment. Koharu fell silent with an angry breath when a laugh from Shikaku rippled from one end of the room to another. Even Tsunade created a smile on her red face. You're hasty to sentence him, Koharu. Why does this boy terrify you? Shikaku asked, unable to resist the unintentional creep of a shaky laughter into his voice that still rattled in his throat. His eyes were on Itaka's ice-cold face, and his flawless indifference and dry humor amused him to no end. The young prodigy was an apt foe in a clash between swords and tongues. Shielding your brother against suspicions of treason? Danzo asked, his voice chilling the air about them like a meeker winter. I am a little disappointed in you. Had it been someone else's boy, you would have been swift to end that threat. Yet you allow this seed to germinate. Why? His eyes had not left Sasuke's, who stared back at him with the same ferocity. His words made Itaka's forefinger tremble a little on the large armrest, but in the shadows, no one saw that tiny moment of weakness. Are you accusing me of conspiring against Leaf? After all, it was I who authorized the mission. Itaka spoke and kept his eyes on the lantern hanging above Sasuke's head. A pink moth had chosen to steal itself to the lanterns inside. Its right wing had already caught fire. Now, it was a futile struggle to save its life. Death was inevitable. Your brother took the task upon himself that got the prisoner killed in your care. Why do you turn your eyes from the truth? Danzo asked again, his words full of grave accusations that drew gasps from Tsunade and Shikaku. Hayashi, however, was still quiet. He was staring at Sasuke, and the anger that burnt in his eyes like the first signs of a furious wildfire. Why did the young Uchiha have such contempt for a council member? What are you insinuating? Tsunade straightened in her chair, her pretty cheeks burning hotly with fury. You very well know, Haim. This boy. I know you're his immutable mouthpiece, but he's not a frail old man he pretends to be. Let him speak, Homura. Away with you, if you so much as attempt to interrupt me again, she said in the harshest tone she could manage. Her sharp eyes sparked anger, and he shivered under her uncompromising gaze. Always quarreling, Haim, Danzo spoke, his right eye moving under the tight bandages. This matter is a little delicate to let this wayward child go. Fu was murdered under questionable circumstances. That makes 2 murders one after another. He could very well be. What is this? Hayashi finally spoke from the shadows in a quiet, thoughtful voice. We were called here for that missed business only. Do not waste my time by piling up baseless accusations to prolong this, Danzo. He hid his stern face well in the room's darkness. Finally, Itaka turned his head to look back at Danzo. It was a silent call for a challenge, his eyes flashing danger on his white face that never let emotions play with it in subtle ways. He had trained it well. I hope you have a good reason to blindside us with this, Itaka spoke, and his heavy gaze settled upon Danzo's old face that was left so pitifully weary by nature's touch that was without its springtime seductions. Danzo adjusted his crippled arm with the good hand and looked down at Sasuke again. Joy and awe went through his soul when he saw the flickering petal-like pattern in his young eyes. It vanished just as quickly. He felt that the boy's eyes were teasing him, tempting him, tormenting him. The allure to possess such power was making him impatient. Fu was killed in the forest by a Kenjutsu master when I had sent him out to investigate Mist's activities. The prisoner was brutally murdered when he could have aided us in laying bare the facts concerning the mission this boy took. This cannot be a coincidence, he spoke, just keeping his voice steady, his fingers trembling around the tip of his walking stick. Sasuke's chakra was deliciously exquisite. His eyes. There was great power in his eyes that it was enough to make an old man slip into a drunken stupor after a mere glimpse of their splendor. Tsunade gave a brusque laugh that shook her breast. To connect something so unrelated to this matter? You know how to spin your yarns, she said, a vicious glare in her eyes. Her red lips quivered, barely holding back the venomous words desperately clinging to her tongue, waiting to tumble out from her mouth. I didn't want that dreg of mist to stay here, but Itaka needed to interrogate him. The cursed seal on him had already left him half dead. I examined it myself. You say that this boy killed a man who Itaka caught by coincidence in the forest? A man who was so delirious that he'd have thought of you as a beautiful woman had he laid his eyes on you? You've grown senile. I support Tsunade-sama's statement, Shikaku said sternly, fingers still twisting that sharp goatee. What motive could this boy have to kill an underling when he wasn't the one who caught him? The prisoner never saw him in the forest. It's a far-fetched idea that you're suggesting. It baffles me that you're even forwarding this agenda in the council hall of all the places. It seems to me that you have a deep-seated grudge against the boy. Danzo spoke no more. Silence fell, and Tsunade grabbed the wooden pen again to scribble down more lines. The scraping sounds echoed in their ears. Then she put the pen back into the ink bottle and returned her gaze to Sasuke's face. He still looked calm. Sharingan had vanished from his eyes, a good trickster. The authorization came from Itaki, is that correct? What happened afterwards? She asked and grabbed the sake cup from the table to take a sip. It was the mildest one they could find for today's task. She did not like the taste on her tongue, sharp and tangy it was, but it was good enough for today. Yes, the captain authorized it. I requested of him to assist me in training a new recruit, Hyuga Hinata, he said, not moving his gaze to see Hayashi's reaction. She was sent along with the captain's team. She was to stay behind him and observe, and engage if he commanded. The matter escalated quickly. The Mizukage had sent in 2 of her guards as a support squad. The captain and I were ambushed by a militia. We dispatched as many as we could. I have no idea about their numbers or how many slipped away. Dear sage, you sent in Hayashi's untrained, timid daughter on such a dangerous mission? Koharu asked, feigning surprise. She wanted a reaction out of Hayashi, but he was silent. Did you not hear that it was a B-rank mission? Tsunade said and moved the pen quickly and harshly on the scroll. If you can't keep a memory, then perhaps, you are too old for these meetings. B and C rank missions are quite common for trainee shinobis. She was also accompanied by the Umbu commander, 2 highly capable jonins, and 1 chunin. I believe we can venture a guess that she was in safe hands, Shikaku added in a heavier tone this time. That smile was still on his lips. He found the elders' attempts to prolong this amusing. He wanted to see why they were so desperate to corner the boy. If it had something to do with the massacre, then he would make sure that it would not happen again. He always found Fugaku to be an honest, a good man. What happened to him was unfortunate. Back then, he voted in his favor, but the entire council was against the man. It was as though they wanted a scapegoat for the masses. He found the evidence too perfect. It did not seem right to do away with him so quickly, but it happened. The carnage. The bloodshed. Many children were orphaned that day, many, struck down. The matter was buried under many lies. Perhaps karma came back to haunt Minato and his reign, bite his flesh away, strip by strip. He could never forget that night. Why continue this, Haim, since you have already decided? Koharu spoke irritably, with a small movement of her quivering hand. The permanent grooves in her face had been deepened by resentment. I have, Tsunade said with a bold, mocking smile bending her luscious lips. You old folks have presented nothing to hold him. All of this is baseless and absurd. The fact that you're accusing Itaki of aiding mist filth is unthinkable. I won't stand for something like this. You, boy, Danzo spoke, drawing Sasuke's eyes to his aged face that worked in indescribable ways to show emotions. How truthful have you been, hiding behind your older brother's back? I do not have time for this pettiness, Hayashi spoke and rose to his feet. He cast a quick glance at Sasuke and then turned his eyes to look at Tsunade. She appeared a little surprised by his reaction. I do not know this boy enough to cast a vote in his favor, but I cannot cast a vote against him, either. This discussion was fruitless, a charade. I have grown weary of them. I am neutral on this matter. You can do as you please with him. Now, if you pardon me, Haim, I have important clan matters to attend rather than indulge Danzo in another one of his games. He cast an angry eye at Danzo and left the hall in silence. The sounds of his steps died away beyond the thick door. Tsunade breathed in deeply. Cast your vote, she said and swiftly took the pen out of the ink bottle again. Those who vote in favor of Uchiha Sasuke leaving this hall and ending his connection with the prisoner and clearing him of all charges, say, I. I, Shikaku said, flicking Sasuke a mischievous glance. The boy was still quiet and calm, though Shikaku admired the sharp glint in his wild eyes. The excitement had made the Tomos reveal themselves again. He was a bold one, indeed. Itaka spoke and kept his gaze steady as he looked at the moth burning and writhing in the lantern. It had struggled well to prolong its life. How futile was that struggle? He found it amusing. Tsunade said with relish and scribbled the results on the scroll. A Hokage's vote was equal to 3 council persons. It was a game Danzo was set to lose from the beginning. You are hasty, Danzo's thin, meaningful voice spoke again. This matter is not as simple as you believe it to be. This boy is connected to Fu's murder. I can feel it in his revenge-soaked eyes. The council did terrible things to his clan. It would seem only fair to him to pay us back. He bore witness to. That is enough, Itaka cut across him in a voice so unfriendly that a shiver of fear ran down Danzo's aged back, his Mangekyo Sharinon glaring at him in a threatening manner. You wear your motley well, but I am amused no longer. I fulfilled your wish to see this through in a just manner, yet still you persist. Danzo met his eyes head-on, but he felt that he was not up to the task to challenge him. This boy is your mistake. You could have ended his life in the past. He will just seek out revenge. I wonder if these murders are the first steps in his journey. No need to be a fool, Itake, he spoke, holding his gaze boldly. Itaka turned his eyes slightly to his brother and found confusion on Sasuke's face as though he was thinking over what Danzo was suggesting and had a question dangling from his tongue. Leave, Uchiha Sasuke, Itaka commanded heavily and watched his brother reluctantly leave the hall. He returned his eyes back to Danzo as the sliver of bright sunlight disappeared when the door was shut. Amongst the roots, a snake hides away for an easy prey, but it always dies there. The roots may trap withered cherry blossoms, but it would not delay the inevitable. Danzo's face showed slight shock. The close-mouthed smile on Itaka's face was meaningful. The young man turned his face away, giving one last glance to the moth. It had burnt away in the lantern and only its blackened body lay close to the flame now. Then Itake rose to his feet and left the hall in silence. I believe we should leave, as well, Tsunade-sama. We still have that sand matter to manage, Shikaka said and Tsunade nodded in response. She rolled up the scroll and walked out of the hall with him. The hall was suddenly enveloped in a menacing silence. It was heavy and dreary. They all sat there without speaking, looking old and decrepit in the tall light from the lanterns. Why does the boy matter so much to you? Koharu asked and adjusted her shawl. The ornaments hanging from the pin in her bun clinked loudly in silence. Danzo remained silent. Rain was soft yet thunder was loud, a beast from sky. Sun was still climbing. A bright light had broken out, a big tear in a cloth on the horizon. Everything was grey and wet around him. He made to take out his sword, but the man that appeared from beyond the trees was whom he was expecting to see. Why have you called me here, Kojuro? Now is not the time for these games, Torin spoke through chattering teeth. Autumn always made him miserable. Kojuro reached into the fanny pack resting on his buttocks and took out a scroll. Torin took it from his hand. May-sama requests a meeting with Danzo, he said and folded his arms across his breast. I doubt Danzo-sama would approve it. The mess you people made, it'd be impossible for the Hokage to overlook this. She's hard-headed, he said and moved the back of his hand across the goggles to wipe away the fog. You can let him decide that, he said. May-sama will be busy with the treaties for a few more weeks. I want you to handle a pest. He narrowed his eyes behind the glasses dotted with raindrops. A pest? Torin asked and shoved the scroll into his pocket. It was up to Danzo to decide, after all. A rumor's spreading in Rain that Kisame's been seen close to some borders. People who work for Leaf there are whispering. It's only a matter of time before he contacts Suijutsu or Sage Forbid, Sasuke, to escalate this. I'm sure your little hearing was a disaster, he said with a wry smile. Torin's lips twitched into a hard scowl, but he did not say anything. Kojuro went on, you couldn't corner that man to delay his involvement. If he catches wind of this and finds Kisame, all is lost. Don't forget, your boss started this and made us suffer. If Kisame talks, Danzo would be the first one to walk to his death. Torin narrowed his eyes. The fog did not bother him that much anymore. He was angry, but he suppressed his anger and watched as Kojuro left him alone in the rain. It was becoming a troublesome matter. Chapter 44, Cherry Blossoms and Roots. It was a cold, cold morning, mist dispersing in the autumn sun's light. Her green eyes could barely see. She was not Sasuke, she did not have his Sharingan. She was jogging towards the forest's edge. They said that purple lilies grew there. It would be an enchanting place. She gained speed, eager to reach the edge, but began to fatigue and slow down. She was not a very fast runner. Sasuke would be angry at the trials again. She thought of him so suddenly. Her smile faded, breaths quickening and getting louder as she tried to quell the rising tornado of her thoughts. He was always upset with her, it was always something little. She realized that he wanted her gone. She squeezed her eyes shut and felt tears dictate grief's path down her cheeks. Tears, warm, and, touched by cold, they bit into her skin. No, deeper than that. Autumn, unkind as Sasuke, its heart, without mercy and pity for her. Suddenly, the breath ached in her tight lungs and throat and she began to tremble. Like spring, she felt forsaken by autumn, by him, empty. Feelings rushed into her, straight to the spirit. She did not know what name she should give them, lust? Love? Hate? It exploded into a wonderful sensation in the deepest, littlest part of her soul, and it crushed her mortal coil into a needy submission she knew to be all too familiar. A delicious torment thrummed to her heart, wounding it beautifully, slicing deep their knife and hand that knew no remorse. The pain. It rattled her flesh and bones, that fierce hatred and indignation shifting to a hurting, slow rise in lust. She could feel her flesh ache with want again. It was in her bones, pulsing in her veins, throbbing in her heart, burning her there violent. Oh, how she loathed this feeling now. How empty it was. How endlessly unsatisfying it was. All it did was make her weak and strip her mortal flesh away for him to peek into her heart and laugh to his heart's content. She had made herself into an object of his mockery. The tears stung and coursed her spring-imitating cheeks and dripped off the tip of her chin. They burnt, telling her tales, her anger and shame. If only she could tear free from the hold he had on her. Why was it so impossible? She blinked, ridding herself of more tears which sat sparkling in her eyes. The thought struck her simple mind to seek answers. There she wandered, peered deep into the darkness that stood about like custodians before the secret's doors. There was nothing to see. Nothing to do. She had submitted her mind and body to him a long time ago. She did not need any reason to love him. She had reasoned back then. How foolish had she been? The thought shook her pride, and a sob stole up to her throat. It hurt her so much to be a fool in love and lust. Why had she never crafted another reason, a reason that she would chase him if he loved her, even just a little, too? He never looked back at her. He avoided her gaze and fled the heavy stare of her eyes, turned wicked by lust's teeth. He treated her like a plague that would taint him if he touched, soil him if he got closer, wound his tongue if he ever forced himself to speak a sweet word for her. Pitiful, very pitiful. She would find a reason for this love. She had to. She gritted her teeth, pressed her hand to her mouth, and swallowed the sobs before they struck the air, shaming her more. She preserved her pride just a little and rejected the feeling of self-pity conquering her mind. She had a bit of power now. It would make him submit. His knees would buckle, and he would cringe, a peasant in prayer. The Uchiha daemons. She would break the older one, and the younger one would have nothing to shield him, wings of a crow. He spread them wide and they cast darkness upon her mind. They would lose their disquieting, terrifying feathers, fall off, wither away. She would take revenge upon them and shred and rip the wings, with false might, and see him fall. In the dark, devil's wings. His whispers were that of a daemon. His tongue was slippery and cunning like a daemon's. He was a daemon, his fluttering spirit, so completely shackled to the younger one. She did not think he had an existence beyond him. A specter, he roamed obsessively about the younger one to protect him from all the wicked men in the world. A trickster that wore disguises to fool them all. He did not fool her. Her jaw set in anger, fingers clenching into fists, and in the eyes, despair and disgust danced. She had fallen on him to seek refuge from the younger one's influence, but he humiliated her. Perhaps she would wound the younger one and watch as he would wallow in despair when he would not be able to protect him. A tremble of a smile told her tale. Her eyes were more honest. Yes, she would break the boy, He was already snared in schemes. How long would he run from the spider's webs? The more he would wriggle, the more helpless his fate. Their fall was inevitable, and it would be glorious and bloody. Her eyes caught sight of Tsunade standing close to the edge, and she stopped abruptly, slipping on the soft ground. She caught her balance before she fell full length on her face. The sound made Tsunade turn. The sunlight shone in her eyes and softened the color there. She smiled. "It's a lovely morning, Sakura," she said and turned around. "I was just asking Itaka what he thought of the forest at this time of the year, but he's too sober for such frankness." Sakura took slow steps and tried to catch her breath, her face red from running. She stopped as her eyes fell upon Itaka. He was standing with his back to the tree. His arms were crossed, and his back was unnaturally straight. Even the pallid morning light did not soften his features. His skin was too white, unnatural in the light. She thought he looked odd, as if he had not soaked up the sun in years. Maybe he really was a daemon. He was looking to his left. It did not seem as though he had even acknowledged her presence. Her eyes narrowed, and she felt a bit of anger in her. She looked away, preferring to see her mentor's kind face instead. "I'll see you in my office at the scheduled time, Itaka," she said to him. He merely uncrossed his arms and walked off towards Konoha. His expression was unreadable save a prideful glint in his Sharingan eye, one which she could bear witness to. He vanished after walking for a few feet. So fast. Like a blur, no, a foreboding, evil shadow moving through the air. She had no wish to see more of him. His face filled her with Sasuke's memories and the shame he purchased for her in abundance. She put her hand to her breast, her breaths finally evening out. The haze of anger and fear cleared from her eyes, and she focused them on the lilies. The shadows were still deep in some places across the valley, but the flowers bloomed fair, and, smiling in shadows, lilies grew about trees. She inhaled deeply, and the fragrance filled her with great warmth. Tsunade smiled at her and rushed down the cliff. She, too, created the same smile and followed her. Her feet did not falter as wind rushed at her from behind. It was cold against her flesh that it made her more aware of the blood running hotly in her body. Sakura's heart took to racing, its beats loud. She finally jumped and stood straight and held her breath to cool off her senses, heart drumming in her ears. She looked about and felt that the sunrise and the strong sunlight made the lilies brighter. They smelt of him, unreal. It was as if she could grasp him. She wanted to trip towards them like a little girl and pluck a few, to feel joy at pressing him close to the heart. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Tsunade asked and pulled in a deep breath. She was looking off into the distance. Another great forest lay beyond the hills. Sakura looked around. The air was cool and sweet-smelling. The shrunken river made nary a sound. It would swell again in spring and summer. "Purple lilies are very peculiar," she began again, and Sakura looked at her face as she turned around. "Petal shedder is what they call it. It's an immortal flower. It never dies. Strange that no season can kill it." Tsunade's smile widened, and then it turned to a pleasant laugh. "It can also be used to kill," she said, and a laugh rippled through her voice. "An immortal flower that kills, too strange, don't you think?" And she was looking at her, and Sakura was looking down. She kept sneaking a gaze back. She did not want to meet her mentor's lovely eyes. They would denude her, make her spill truth against her will. It was quiet, silence had fallen on the valley. The river did not even sigh like a sleeping babe. Moments passed and sweat beaded on the back of Sakura's neck. The air around her smelt like sweat now. She bent down and settled herself amongst the flowers, eyes bent on the purple lilies that hid amidst many other flowers, played in the breeze. The flowers' many shadows proved to their refuge from the sun, which was stronger this morning. "Why did you make a poison out of this flower, Sakura?" she asked, searching out Sakura's eyes that flit stubbornly from one well-hidden lily to another like a proverbial pink moth. Sakura dragged her eyes up to meet her gaze. There was revulsion in the green depths, but it was blunted by sadness and love. "I don't know," she replied softly, her mouth drawn down in a trembling bow. Her eyes began to stream out scalding tears. They burned her the way they always did. The shame made her bend her head down even more, her shoulders stiffened and then they stooped. She wanted to hide her face. Did Danzo ask you to choose this flower? Tsunade asked and moved towards her. Sakura only heard the rustling of dry grass, she did not raise her head to look back at her. Sakura shook her head and moved the back of her shaky hand across her eyes. She held back the prickly tears that threatened to erupt and tried hard to control the trembling shaking her body like a dried-up sakura flower. Then why? Why would you choose this flower when you know it's Sasuke's favorite? Tsunade asked, and her voice died in the valley's vastness quickly. There was a sad tone to her voice, she could not hide it the way she had intended. Sakura stopped and clenched her trembling fingers into fists on her thighs. I wanted something that would make me run away. She raised her head with a sharp jerk, face warped in distress. There was such anguish in her gaze that Tsunade did not know what to say. I wanted to be free, she said in a shaky, loud voice and pulled herself up to her feet that did not have enough will to support her quivering frame. I'm his prisoner. I've tried and I've tried, but I can't seem to let go this feeling, this need I feel for him. It shames me. How can he punish me for this? Her breath had hitched in a broken sob, and she hissed with an unseen pain that tore her body apart. Tsunade could only stare, eyes wide open. The sadness on her face had given way to shock. Her lips, sealed tight on her fair face. The cold wind did not seem to bother her as it stubbornly pressed against her face like flies. She did not even know it was there. He isn't fair. He's never fair to me. She said loudly, and her angry words echoed in the broad valley. He hurts me. He loves to hurt me. Taunt me. When all I've ever asked him was a bit of his love. Is that too much to ask? Her fists were shaking. Her face was shaking. Her whole body was shaking. Anger had completely consumed her. Sakura, you. She whispered, and then she could say no more. Her lower lip trembled with emotion, and grief came into her eyes and face. Sakura was like a daughter to her, and to see her like this was tormenting her. She looked at the sun-mellowed pink hair whipping around her face. Her cheeks and nose were the color of her hair. Tears streaked her features in the multitude, and she wore her emotions for all to see. She looked sad, and there was nothing she could do for the girl she thought to be her daughter. I'm tired of him rejecting me all the time. What have I done wrong? What can others give him that I can't? Sakura stopped, quite suddenly, on a shout, looking at Tsunade in a manner as though she was pleading. I just wanted his love, a bit of his heart. He couldn't even give me a bit of his time, little kindness that'd be enough to fool me that he her voice balked and great wrenching sobs took over. She pressed her shaking fingers to her lips and squeezed her eyes tight, letting the last bit of tears, still standing in her eyes, flow down the cheeks unopposed. Tsunade clenched her teeth. She wanted to weep. She pitied her. You foolish girl, she hissed, her shoulders shook from suppressing her tears, but she did not let them materialize in her eyes. She was stronger than that. You're going to kill yourself over this boy. Why are you doing this to yourself? I don't understand you. How much more have you done for Danzo? Sakura looked at her with emptiness in her eyes and a bit of shock she could not conceal. I'm not. Don't lie to me, Tsunade cut her off, angry. Don't be a fool. If Ataka catches wind of this, he will kill you without remorse, and I'd never even know about it. Don't expect anything less from him. Do you hope to outwit that man? Doesn't it scare you this side of yourself? You're walking off to your own death. Don't do this. Don't be a fool. I love you, Sakura. I love you so much, like I've never loved another. I brought you up like a daughter. Don't repay me so unkindly. Sakura bit her lower lip and stared down to her feet. In distress, she had trampled on some lilies. They were dead, and she felt a bit of satisfaction at their fate. The immortal flower was mortal once more. I love him so much, she said, voice a whisper, so much that it hurts, but I hate him just the same. He's unkind to me. He wouldn't lose anything if he gave me some of his moments, but he doesn't care. He just doesn't care. He's so selfish. Tsunade was silent, her heart, a loud gong. Sakura had slipped far into the darkness of her heart. Why did she never see it? Her breast grew tighter and tighter till she felt that she could not even breathe. If Sakura did anything foolish, Itaka would kill her. If she pulled her back from Danzo so quickly, he would kill her. A wave of helplessness crashed over her and she wanted to let out a desperate cry. What should she do to help her? What? I made the poison to get out. Deep down, I wanted him dead so that I could run away, she said, anguish hitting her raw, her eyes filled with torment, and they cut Tsunade's heart in two. As long as he lives like he does now, I can never. He isn't fair. He isn't fair. Her eyes dropped to the flowers again, and she spoke no more. The mentor closed her eyes. Her heart was crashing violently against the lungs. It struggled as it felt a burden pressing down upon it, crushing it without kindness. She breathed in cool breaths and a thought came to her. It calmed that raging, wild heart, and it began to beat with a pace that was bearable for her. Go and do your missions, she spoke suddenly, without looking at Sakura. Her eyes were looking up. Sun had ensconced itself in the sky, the ritualistic climb was complete. I will see you tomorrow. Sakura looked back at her reluctantly, but she did not say anything. She bowed dutifully before the mentor she loved and ran out of the valley, still carrying the same thoughts in her mind. Night had fallen. It happened routinely. Shadows advanced quietly like shinobi, and a crow cawed nastily outside the window. It distracted her eyes for a moment. Itake made her afraid. Continue, Sakura, Torin said, standing beside Danzo. He sat in a large chair shrouded in shadows. He liked to sit like this. Root's leader was a strange old man. The crow cawed one more time and flew away. The loud sound lingered and trailed off like a whine, and then it vanished. She pulled her eyes away from the window and looked down at the report. The Yamanaka sensor examined him. He found nothing out of the ordinary. His bones were broken at several places. He suffered a terrible accident. It was like everything the Umbu captain suggested, she said and fell silent and her eyes still tried to determine which expression the man wore today, but it was impossible to tell. Danzo drew in a shaky breath. The cold wind did not suit him in old age. He gestured Torin to close the window and he obliged. I wonder how he sustained them. He spoke and breathed in through his nose, and his sagging cheeks puffed out as though he was preparing himself to whistle. You can leave, Sakura. The moon dipped a bit, and she saw his aged lips moving in the dark. Sakura bowed and made to turn, but she stopped. She looked back to him with something of a fearful look in her eyes and face. Might I ask something? She asked and lowered her eyes to the floor. It was a little dusty, and the wood, a little old. She did not know why he preferred to sit there close to the window when he got it closed without much thought. She thought that he wanted to look at the clear sky at night, but she was not sure of this. Danzo straightened in his chair and nodded, his eyes closing with a calm heaviness. Time had made him feel its presence through the years. Sakura inhaled a deep and full breath, heart beating faster, and she smelt the wood smoke smell that rose up like vapors in the room. It was probably a special kind of chakra-infused wood. Can't Itaka be cornered to get Suzuki's eyes? She asked and immediately lowered her eyes again as if she had spoken of something unthinkable. Itaki is content with the Uchiha fate, and with the backing of the accursed Fire's councilman, he holds a lot of power. Within and without the clan. It is not possible to ruin him without Suzuki, he spoke in a rough, heavy voice, his hand trembling on the tip of that crooked walking stick. It looked nothing more than a thick branch he had cut some extra twigs off. It is the younger one who is restless. Mei contacts him. Fu disappears. I can see it in his eyes. But, Naruto, she fell silent and pressed her lips together with worry. The seals you have been given simply test his eyes' strength, he spoke and fisted his hand over the tip more firmly. The talk of Suzuki's eyes made him impatient. It is not meant to harm Naruto. He is resilient as a vessel. He will not die. Sakura peered at him through the pink hairs. They clung to the cold sweat on her skin. He attacked Hinata last time. It's getting worse. I don't understand. You said Naruto won't get hurt. She said in an anxious voice that came out a little louder than she had hoped, and immediately, she regretted it. The man, born of Leaf's shadow half, made her afraid. Why would I harm the vessel of the essence, foolish girl? He spoke and created an odd sort of smile, and she saw a row of even teeth peeking out of his sagging mouth. Sasuke is a treacherous boy. The Uchiha are treacherous by nature. They harmed the vessel last time. Your mentor was a council member back then. She, Hiruzen, and Shikaku buried it under many lies, but it does not change their treachery. If he is capable of controlling the beast, he needs to be dealt with. Such power should never belong to traitors. The wind shushed outside, and her gaze wandered a little towards the window again. The just demise of his clan's branch has only fueled his hate, he spoke, and his words dragged Hermur's reminiscent eyes back to him again. I have heard whispers from Umbu that he disobeys his brother these days. The older one protects him well. He needs to slip a little, and I will dismantle his mind to reveal his secrets. He killed my loyal subordinate. He cannot be forgiven. He breathed heavily with emotions. Sakura peered into the dark that glutted all about him. Fu was Ino's familiar and her cousin. She was hurt by his death. Ino was her childhood friend. Thinking, she sucked in a breath through her teeth. She loved him, but she resented his cruelty more. Her resolve was made. What will be his fate? She asked and put her hand to her breast. Her heart was fluttering pitifully at her cold decision to pay him back. Danzo exhaled. The sound of his labored breath was loud. Sweat dripped in beads across his forehead, his right eye dilating in the dark. Something had made him excited, but it was too much for his old age to savor it fully. The eyes will be taken from him, and his monstrous chakra will be sealed away. He spoke and saw a little shock run across her face, and in her mind, he stumbled across her memories. The Uchiha will be disgraced. Anyone who shielded him will pay the price. Compensation for his crimes will be enormous. They will get a pardon for the strength of Konoha's military, but Itachi will have no choice but to oust the boy from the clan. Will he sell out his own brother? He appears to hold him very dear, she said, her heart starting to beat, crescendoing to a loud staccato, a terrible broken instrument. Her eyes were wide. Could she make Sasuke hers this way? The mere thought of the possibility was thrilling. Danzo let out a subdued laugh that had just a touch of greed and cunning. Itachi has but one weakness, and he likes keeping it close to his breast. It is like a hurting vein. As long as it is not touched, he obeys without condition. He will keep the beloved boy in his possession as long as he functions. He will not care what the boy loses to stay alive. He is very a peculiar man, he spoke and placed the full weight of his hand on the stick. It trembled, but he managed to raise himself to his feet. If Sasuke is crushed, Itachi will be defeated, as well. If the young hawk falls, the crow will not be far behind. He will be thrown out of the council, a fitting end for his ways. A slow smile trembled across her lips. A defeated Sasuke? A helpless Sasuke? A Sasuke without his pride and Sharingan that he always used to reject her? It was a dream come true. Her eyes sparkled as shock assaulted her mind. It was surreal to be in a position to grasp such a wonderful dream where Sasuke would be bound to her, always. Her fingers trembled on her heaving breast. Words could not even trip from her tongue to tell him of how she felt. She had not felt this happy since she first saw him in the Chunin Academy. She would force that innocence upon him, which he had discarded years ago to play games, the innocence that would be free of his pride. Without his toys, he would come to love her, cherish her, thank her that she had shouldered his nature for years in hopes that he would return her yearnings someday. She would save him from his own darkness. If that was all it took, then so be it. The loud sound from a crow tried to distract Sakura again, but she did not hear it, heed the warning she thought it gave her. At this moment, the darkness was beautiful. The sound of another crow invaded her thoughts. She was distracted for a moment, a cup of sake in her hand. She took a generous sip of it and put it back on the large table, her cheeks a little pink from intoxication. She directed her eyes back to his. He had not taken his Sharingan out. I need your help, she spoke, her brown eyes hard and determined. Sasuke could have been interrogated more, but I protected him. It's your turn to stay true to your promises. He did not say anything. He was quiet. His eyes turned red, and she knew that his Sharingan answered her. Times are hard, she began, inching closer to him. It's difficult to find trust in our government. Danzo has sympathizers everywhere. If he's not stopped, he'd take advantage of us all. He dragged his eyes up and down over her. He measured her like he measured all. Is that all you desire? He asked and created a embarrassed smile she could not notice in the dark. The shadows clung to him like hopeful women, they did not seem to want to part from him for now. Tsunade's smile changed to a soft laugh, and she placed her hand to his cheek and felt the skin's smoothness. It shocked her for the first time that how young he was. I've seen you grow up, Itake, she said, with a sincere smile. You were a boy of 12 when you came to Umbu. I thought it was wrong, terrible to task young soldiers with leaf's burdens, but I couldn't stop anyone. Her hand came away, and she heaved a sigh. I never wanted this for you, this life of burden for a young boy. I feel that it changed you over the years, made you hard but time had not given me power back then. I have it now. I can throw this diseased man out of our ranks, make things different this time, she said with gentleness and reached her hand up again to brush her fingers across his forehead, a mother's gesture. What more could a weary old woman want from you? Ask and you might receive, he spoke, his tone almost dulcet, mellifluous. The sherry non smoldered hotly in his eyes. An eerie emotion burnt there, but she was not clever enough to name it. As always, his face was calm, she could read nothing there. She pulled her hand back and smiled. You precocious little boy, Tsunade said, amused, and backed away. She grabbed her cup again and looked back to him. I showed my cooperation when this matter was a little grave. His lies have a sway on you. I can mollify many fevers. He spoke again in a voice that was new to her. Tsunade looked into the cup and then back to him. He was looking out the window. That sherry non had lost a bit of its fever, too. I didn't call you here to. She stopped when his eyes found hers again, pierced into hers like knives, fierceness returning to that deep dark maw, satisfy my fevers. You want the same thing. What did Sasuke do to make the old fool say that with such certainty? He did something terrible, didn't he? She took a quick sip of her drink. Her comment had not made that look go away. It only intensified as something else, something menacing, mingled delicately with his red's nature. Are you resorting to blackmail, Hokage-sama? He spoke, the honorific rolling off his tongue a little sweetly. No, she said and put the cup down and turned around to face him, I want to rid Konoha of him. Cut the roots. Make the tree grow higher. I've grown tired of his schemes, his radical ideals. I need someone to get me a scroll, an important one. Only you're capable of it. He was silent. His eyes were playing odd tricks on her mind that she felt something stir in her a little. Break a girl's mind with your illusions. Rip that seal apart. Tear that memory out and get me the scroll. And she paused, dragging in a single deep breath, I will protect Sasuke, always. She looked sincere. Honest. He regarded her pink face for a moment longer. Tsukuyomi will kill anyone swiftly who is not an Uchiha. It must be a powerful family if it hides something you are so restless for, he spoke, tone unchanging, and it still made her uneasy, made her feel that sensation again. Are you willing to kill a girl from a powerful family to secure your reign? You surprise me. She's no saint, she said, and a little anger came into her voice against her will. Your genjutsu is capable of sinister things. So many secrets, rumors that it tampers with the minds. Do it again. Do it for me this time. Just get me that scroll, and I don't care what Sasuke does, as long as you can keep him in line. Silence fell around them. A slow smile came to attack his face, but he said nothing. Chapter 45, Lady of the Wolves. It was raining again, a light rhythm that made his heart thump out unpleasant tunes. He was a little irritated. Rain fell against the stones, tiles on the waiting place's roof, and basin. It was overflowing with water. The stepping stones were slick and wet, grass, soggy. The lanterns sitting by the stones were out. He could make out shapes of droplet-adorned kirins and weasels and crows on them. He was asked to bare his upper arms for today by Tsunade. It was done to show the Umbu commander's tattoo. This one was different from the others and had 4 droplet-like patterns that created a single black shuriken. Such a serious affair. Bear it for all eyes to see. He never understood its significance. His stature in Leaf's military was not a hidden affair. He closed his eyes, thinking. Tsunade. Okamai clan. Konoha elders have kept strange allies, he spoke, eyes shining like the brightest fireflies in the darkest spaces of her office. They did. Tsunade paused, taking a quick sip and looking back into his eyes. Still do. I thought you to be an obedient boy, Itake. Do I sense a little change in you? Change can be sweet. She smiled, and her eyes twinkled in the lantern's light. Itake was silent. A strong wind was blowing outside, but its grave sounds did not invade his thoughts. Those were his territories, his private places. His lies hid there, carving themselves into memories, tearing them up to create new patterns, such wondrous landscapes. They were limitless in their recreations and destructions. An odd little thing, a natural little thing. I'm sending you as an Umbu captain to oversee the bandit business. They've been creating trouble for their outposts, she said and eyed the cup with a single frown in her brow. The cup was empty now. She put it down with a little force, as if its emptiness angered her, and returned her attention back to the man standing in the dark. We've asked for their aid concerning our outposts, as well. You have to break open the seal on that girl before the task ends. You will not get another chance, we will not get another chance. The magic of the Uzumaki? Tricksters, he spoke, sounding almost amused. His eyes stayed the same, like the unmoving lake's deep. Make light of it if you wish, boy, but that seal prevents you from breaking through the barriers in her head, she said and inhaled sharply. You won't get the scroll or its location without reading that girl's mind. She is their secret keeper. He asked and moved his head a little that his eyes seemed to appear like two burning moths hovering in the air, awaiting rebirth. They're always daughters. They're taught to be good strategic Ians, she said and suddenly let out a laugh. It's strange that they're shunned from becoming shinobis. Their minds are strong. It's a genetic trait passed on through women in their line. A strong burst of chakra guards their thoughts. It's turned into an impenetrable barrier with the seal. Even a Sharinon can't break through, but you're different, Itake. There were a few words on his tongue, icy words which lingered there, bitter words, but he chose silence. She went on with a smile dancing on the lips, painted red daily to tempt. You must find the scroll in her memories. It tells the tale of the night connected to a grave matter. I want to know what happened all those moons past. Lightning flashed, and his face came into view just once before it was hidden away by darkness again. It was a little rigid, a little cold. There is no guarantee that this venture will gain me enough time to use Tsukuyomi upon her, he spoke, and his words were void of emotions. It can kill her before I avail a chance to open the seal. Are you willing to start a conflict over a trinket that might be of no use to you now and earn us all a war in return? She narrowed her eyes, and a bold smile broke out on her face, touched with but a hint of rossiness about the cheeks. Are you unwilling to take risks for your brother? I thought he was so dear to you. She asked and saw the red spots float a little to the right. I suppose words are only words, after all. I am not a proverbial, burden-bearing mule, attached to an old cart with a carrot and a stick in the front, he spoke with a dry tone to his voice. I am willing to do many things, but a war means that you grant Danzo a reason to proceed on with his lofty ideals. You would have paved his path for him. What are you thinking? If she dies, who would know it was you? She asked, the corners of her mouth trembling to form a full smile on that lovely face nodding in challenge and bits of anger and excitement. The thrills of the seat are head-spinning, but that should not cloud your judgment, he spoke, and the fires in his eyes burned brighter. Okamai work for Cloud. They are their hounds. The new treaty in place will be shred to pieces by this grave mistake. It could fan flames of war and everyone will lose. Everything. Don't play games with me, boy. Tsunade said, her voice hissing in cold fury. Answer me. Who else would know? Her face had changed. He saw it harden with trappings of disdain and authority, and he knew he had to answer. No one, Itake spoke slowly, and his red eyes watched a gray strip of shadow come over her fair face and lie there like the lightest of curtains. Then I'm not asking you, Itake, I'm telling you to come through and bring me that scroll, she said, and her voice rose wildly with command. Her eyes had tracked his face amidst the shadows. It was as though they receded back at her whim. She looked ferocious, the lantern's light shining in her eyes, granting their woodsy browns a strange fire he did not witness, often. She amused him. As you wish, he agreed and spoke no more. His face was completely emotionless. A war? Slightly concerned by her bullheaded decision, he did not let anything reveal itself on his face and brow. He turned around and made to leave when she spoke again. She loves to indulge in beautiful things a bit foolhardy. She poured out another cup of sake. Itaka blinked, his sherry non vanished, eyes upon her face again. She was wearing a mischievous smile now, cheeks warming up when she took a sip of that red one, and she took it with great relish. What are you suggesting? He asked and moved his head just a little to feel a cool draft, coming in from a tiny gap in the window, on his right cheek. You'll see, she said, smiling. Her cheeks grew redder and redder as though she was tasting that sake for the very first time. I asked Sakura about that flower you spoke of. She made the poison because your brother is cold to her, a symbol of freedom, as she told me. Nothing more. Danzo had little to do with that choice. I am crushed with surprise, he spoke, and it was hard to miss that dry sarcasm in his voice. I know she can be overbearing, but it wouldn't hurt Suzuki to be a little kind to her, she said and drank the final mouthful of sake and placed the cup aside. He's so young. He can still learn. You only strive to discipline him. Teach him to be kind, too. Itaka merely smiled and turned around to leave. He opened the door, and her words stopped him from leaving. Autumn moths are always male and purple lilies are unisexual male flowers, too, she said, her voice heavy with emotions. The pink moths that birth the purple ones die. They either burn to death on the purple lantern's flames they think to be lilies, or autumn moths' poison gets them. If they're lucky to survive autumn, winter becomes their grave. Your brother may have the allure of the lilies, but Sakura's no pink moth. You will keep your flames away from her at the cost of your brother's safety. He heard her take a deep breath, and she spoke again, her words a little cold enough to touch his skin and make it shiver with delight. I wonder which one of you worships the other as if he's a faultless kami. And her words died into silence, and he looked at her and smiled before he left her alone in the office's darkness. Itaki opened his eyes, and a dimmed sunlight greeted him. He tilted his head slightly down to look at that thin scar line. He would have preferred to conceal it. Now, he was wearing it on himself like a half-heartedly accepted mark of battle, a show of courage. A healed scar that was clean and straight started from his shoulder and cut through that shuriken etched into his skin, like a keen sword, and traveled down and disappeared behind the black gloves that trailed up well past his elbows. Displeasure came across his face, but it disappeared quickly. Wind rushed at him from the left, and he turned his face away from the brunt of chill. The metal armguards on his arms were dotted in rainwater. The rain mellowed again, and, abruptly, the shushing sound died down. Kai suddenly appeared from behind the trees. He opened the bamboo gate and made his way to Itaka. He was pink in the face. Itaka-sama, the Shichi squad raided the outskirts. They found some hidden outposts, but the bandits got away, he said, exhaling loudly, his warm breath like feathery wisps in the cold. I did not expect them to find anything, he spoke and turned his gaze a little to an old man standing under the tea house's broad roof. A pipe was tucked at the left corner of his mouth, and he was squinting his eyes against the smoke. A cascade of rainwater fell down in front of him from the fine-tiled roof. He could see his aged feet trembling from the rain's spray. Itaka brought his eyes back to Kai. Tell Serizawa to inform the woman to meet me in the sitting room, he spoke and moved to his right. It was customary to rinse the hands and mouth before entering the tea house. He palmed water into his mouth, spat it out, and washed his hands next. The stone path was slippery, wind cold, but his heartbeat was rock solid. The old man bowed low and muttered a shaky greeting. He opened the sliding door, and a warm tea scent rushed at him from the inside. Taking off his wet sandals, he stepped onto the wooden floor, and the door was slid shut behind him. Scrolls hung on the walls, and a partition screen separated the entrance from the anteroom. A little issue of smoke crept up from behind the screen, and silhouettes of women moved left and right daintily over the fine painting. It showed wilted higanbana in winter, faded red spots in snow. Itaki opened the sliding door on his right. The sitting room was small, a well-crafted mat covered the floor, and sandalwood's fragrance filled the air, mixing together with chamomile's and smoke's familiar scents. The girls had already performed the incense ceremony. He closed the door and sat down cross-legged by the sunken fireplace. The coal was burning, and the teapot hanging above it was red-hot. He closed his eyes and listened to the soft sounds of a woman's steps. Not a moment later, the door behind him was opened and closed with feminine care. Then, as though announcing her arrival, a smell of flowers crawled up his nose. This woman liked her perfumes. The steps made their way around him, soft and light like a child's, and he opened his eyes to gaze upon the woman before him. She was young, 26 years of age, he assumed. She wore a touch of traditional makeup on her face, a shade of berries painted her lips red, and bits of artificial color, a rosy blush, dusted her powdered white cheeks. She bent her head and knees slightly and spoke in a lilting voice that matched her smile's sweetness. "It is an honor to meet you, Itaki-sama. I am a Bukura Kikyo from the Okamai clan." Carefully, she settled herself down on the cushion and opened the hand fan in her hand with the practiced flick of her wrist. Then she raised her hand and held the fan before her face. He could only see her eyes and a portion of her right cheek now. "When my men from Shichi told me that the head of the Uchiha clan and commander of Umbukor had agreed to our terms, I expected someone elderly, but," she stopped, sighed, and her eyes shrank to tiny slivers that set that red makeup around them aflame in the fire's light. "You are such a beautiful man. It is almost wicked the way you look unfair. I have heard that your brother is even more beautiful than you. Is that true? I believe it to be so unreal." Then she emitted a constrained laugh, almost kissing the fan in girl-like delight. Itaki saw her lips curled in a smile behind the fan. "Are you flattering me?" he asked and saw that cunning smile widen a bit. "No, sage no, Itaki-sama," she said and fluttered the fan in her hand. "I have little need for fake flatteries. I simply love beautiful things and I am honest about them. Like this blood-red fan in my hand and that long curve of your white throat." She closed the fan a little harshly in her firm fist and lowered her hand, and the beads dangling from the pins in her buns chinked. Her smile was gone, her eyes almost predatory in the fire's strong light. He fixed her with a cool gaze for a moment and spoke, "The bandits you spoke of in your missive. Their outposts are empty. I thought your men had everything under control. Where did they hide this time?" Kikyo moved her arm up and pressed the hand covered by that long colorful sleeve to her lips, and then she let out a muffled little laugh. "Silly little men," she said, and the laughter rattled through her breast. "I told them that they could have checked the outposts in the mountains, but I am a simple-minded woman in their eyes. They hardly listen to me, Itaki-sama. Perhaps, now that you are here, they might get a little motivated to locate the hideouts. A Byakugan would have sufficed, yet you wanted a Sharingan wielder." He spoke and saw something flare in her eyes quickly and powerfully. "Forgive my mawkishness, but you are as cold as the color of your throat, Itaki-sama. A little red of the fan would suit you well," she said, her voice subdued. "I wanted to see the Sharingan. It has been so long since I laid my eyes on one. It imbues things with wondrous colors. Not everything looks beautiful if it is black or white." She spoke with softness again that one rosy cheek he could see tightened with a smile. "Are beautiful colors the only reason for your requests? You are overindulgent. Perhaps your men are wary for a reason," he spoke, and she let out another trill of laughter, her shoulders heaving. It seemed to him that she enjoyed the sound of her own laughter. She opened her fan again and moved it slowly back and forth above her breast. He could barely see her face behind its movements. Let the lady keep a bit of her mystique. She tilted her head down a little as though she was bowing. "All in due time. I shall satisfy every little curiosity of yours, and you will satisfy every bit of mine," she stressed on the word "will" rather severally. Silence fell heavily, and in that fraction of silence in between, he heard a stone break outside. Storms had cracked it open at last. "Tell your men to prepare themselves. I would require their lists, and if the Hokage approves, we will take our leave at sunrise," he spoke in a heavy voice, laced with a bit of command. "Snow might fall on the mountains, one man told me under the expanse of stars yesterday. They twinkled and glimpsed like little fish in a pond," Kikyo said and looked him straight in the eyes. showing great intensity and fire in them. He laid down a white cloth on the grass and asked of me to prick my finger just a bit. It was beautiful the way red drops spread on white and soaked through. It pained me a bit. And then it was pleasure. My skin. Awash in desires. I wonder if snow, white as your throat, looks like that, too, when it is touched by red like that. Kikyo closed her eyes and let out a long, weary sigh and got to her feet. She bowed before him and silently left the room the same way she came. He heard her leave and at last he looked at the red fan she had left on the cushion. Try as he might, he could not remember meeting any woman as strange as her. Time was short, and the Lady of the Wolves, a bit sly. This would be difficult. I can't grant you a leave, Suzuki said and placed the scroll back on the table. The team has fallen behind in my absence, and you need to do many missions before you understand what it means to work in missions. But she protested and stopped abruptly. Her eyes were upon his face that looked bright in the morning light. The clouds had broken apart and rain was gone. Sun had taken over, and she felt warmth's tingling sensation on her right cheek. You're the one who wanted to come back to this life, Hinata, he said and pulled at his drawer to take out another scroll. I hope these are the thrills you were looking for. He unrolled the scroll and gazed at her again, an insouciant look on his face. Minato-sama has summoned me and Naruto-ku Naruto to his manner to talk. She broke off and pressed a frightened hand against her breast to calm her heart that protested louder than her tongue. Talk about the heir. I have to be there, or else Oto-sama would be shamed as he made him a promise. She huffed out a sigh and lowered her eyes. She looked ashamed. A chill went through Suzuki, and a shiver shook his legs, and he got up from the chair almost against his will. Did you find out about the payment Minato was involved in? He asked and drew closer. Hinata raised her eyes and found him standing only 2 feet from her. Her face grew warm, and she looked down to her hands again. She was holding her fist tightly in the other hand. No, I'm sorry. I couldn't find anything in my house, she said, rubbing her fingers together nervously. That's too bad, he said, his tone soothing and cool, and moved his hand to grab a tuft of her hair from over her breast. It would have helped you so much. Hinata's heart was ringing in her ears, eyes moving over the mischievous expression of his face, and with this countenance, he seemed like a boy up to no good. Helped me? She asked weakly, and her face broke out in sweat. An electric current traveled from the hair he was rubbing slowly between his fingers to her heart, and it felt lovely. Yes. He said in an excited little voice, drawing so close that her heart began to leap and swell and flutter in wild anticipation. If Minato was involved with Danzo in something nasty that isn't a part of records, you can use the evidence to break free if he doesn't let you. It'd be easy that way. Your father will be free of his schemes, as well. Wouldn't it all come together just wonderfully? He bent his head down, and his warm breaths felt hot on her neck and cheek. Why you think so? Hinata asked, skin trembling on her young flesh, mouth smiling in a way as though she was caught up in the boy-child tricks of his sherry non. I know so, Suzuki replied playfully and bent further down to whisper, take a leave of 2 days. I'll come to your house when the night falls. His voice rippled deliciously in her ear, and when he backed away, she desired for him to touch her there with his lips again. He flicked his head to indicate that she should leave. She bowed and left the room in silence. A moment passed and Suijitsu stepped into his office. His purple eyes fell upon Suzuki's face, rife with irritation and frustration and determination, and he created a sheepish grin in response. Nii-sama took Karen with him, and Yugo was sent away by Tsunade to manage the bandit business to the east, he said, and his eyes shrank into severe red slits. What am I to do with the one person I don't need right now? Hey, I may be made of water, but I've got meself a lil hurt. He said in mock indignation and slammed his fist into his puffed-out breast as if Suzuki did not know where his heart was. Suzuki did not smile and looked at the window. The sun was burning as brightly as fires, and the light was strong. All that rainwater in the grounds would evaporate by noon. I went to that damned hearing, did all that was asked of me, but Nii-sama still doesn't trust me, he said and brought his eyes back to Suijitsu whose smile had turned into a teeth-filled grin by now. I don't, either, he said, laughter in his voice, but his trust's the least of ya problems. Kai might stay here. I get a feelin' that this one just doesn't like ya, and then we, ave ya brothers nasty lil crow sittin' and poopin' in the only tree outside ya office. I feel so sad for ya, lovely. Suzuki's lips curled in impish delight. The crow should vanish in a week or two. The bandit business is nasty and it'll take time. I've heard that Kikyo's no easy meal. I don't know why my brother went to that wench when he could have arranged for someone else from Umbu. I wonder. He said and looked up at the fan in thought. The spider's web still existed between the blades, and he had asked of the cleaning staff to get rid of it, too. It doesn't matter. The bandits will attack that Leaf's outpost soon at the call of a hawk, yes. Slippin' out during the chaos? Ya a nasty lil kid, Suzuki, Suijitsu said and let out a rough laugh. How do ya plan on making that crow vanish? The fucking thing doesn't quit. What did ya do, ya wicked boy? He crossed his arms and wore a big grin on his face. He watched as a cool and cunning look came over Suzuki's face completely. You'll see, Suzuki whispered and his eyes were red, and Suijitsu could only manage a laugh. These brothers were so amusing. Check the description for the links to the author.